Hey there, night owls! Tonight we're stepping into the smoky, gaslit streets of Victorian England, where everything looks delicious, smells amazing, and might actually kill you. We're talking about an era when your morning bread could contain crushed bones, your children's candy was literally painted with lead, and that refreshing glass of milk? Let's just say the cow had very little to do with it. This is the story of how an entire nation got slowly poisoned by its own grocery list, and how one humble, overlooked product changed everything. So before we dive into this deliciously disturbing chapter of history, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from tonight? What time is it in your corner of the world? I genuinely love knowing who's along for the ride. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's walk together through the Victorian marketplace, where beauty was deadly, cheap was dangerous, and trust was the most expensive ingredient of all. Ready? Let's go. Picture yourself walking through the streets of London in 1850-something. The gas lamps are flickering to life along the crowded thoroughfares, casting dancing shadows on the cobblestones still wet from the afternoon rain. And as you turn the corner onto one of the city's bustling market streets, your senses are immediately overwhelmed by what can only be described as a Victorian assault on every receptor your body possesses. The noise hits you first. Hawkers shouting over one another, each voice competing for your attention and your pennies. Fresh eels, lovely eels, hot pies, piping hot, sweets for the little ones, prettiest sweets in London. The cacophony blends with the rumble of cartwheels on stone, the clip-clop of horses, the chatter of 1,000 souls all pursuing the same basic goal, finding something affordable to put in their stomachs before the day ends. Then comes the smell, and oh, what a smell it is! Roasting chestnuts mingling with the savoury steam rising from meat pie stalls, the sweet caramel fragrance drifting from a candy vendor's cart, the earthy scent of fresh bread, or what passes for fresh bread, wafting from a nearby bakery. Underneath it all, of course, there's the ever-present perfume of Victorian urban life, horse manure, coal smoke, and the distant but unmistakable tang of the Thames at low tide. But let's focus on the pleasant notes for now. We'll get to the other stuff soon enough. And finally there's the sight of it all. The market stalls draped in colourful fabrics, displaying their wares like treasure chests opened for your inspection. Pyramids of apples polished to an almost suspicious shine. Wheels of cheese stacked like golden towers. Jars of pickles glinting in the lamplight. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, sweets. Candies in every colour imaginable. Brilliant reds, sunshine yellows, vibrant greens, deep purples that seem to glow with an inner light. They're arranged in patterns designed to catch your eye and loosen your purse strings, these little jewels of sugar and sweetness, these tiny promises of pleasure wrapped in paper twists. To the average Victorian shopper, this market is a wonderland. After a long day of labour in a factory, a workshop, or a wealthy household, this riot of colour and aroma represents something precious, choice, pleasure, a small luxury within reach of even the most modest budget. For a penny or two, you can buy happiness in edible form. You can treat your children to something beautiful. You can forget for just a moment that your life consists largely of work, sleep, and the eternal quest to stay one step ahead of poverty. But here's the thing about wonderlands, and this is a truth that Lewis Carroll understood perhaps better than anyone. They're not always what they seem. Behind every beautifully coloured sweet in this Victorian marketplace, there lurks a secret that the vendor would very much prefer you didn't discover. Because that brilliant red candy your daughter is begging for, the one that looks like a tiny ruby glowing with wholesome fruity promise, there's an excellent chance it contains no fruit whatsoever. The colour comes from something called red lead, also known as minium, also known as a compound that would make a modern toxicologist weep into their hazmat suit. That sunny yellow treat shaped like a lemon drop? The cheerful hue might well be courtesy of chromate of lead, a substance whose primary use in other contexts involved painting carriages and, not coincidentally, slowly poisoning the workers who handled it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we dive into the specific horrors lurking inside Victorian confectionery, and trust me, we're going to dive deep, let's take a moment to understand why this marketplace exists as it does. Why is a working-class mother choosing between food that might feed her family and food that might slowly poison them? The answer, as with most things in history, comes down to economics, opportunity, and the eternal human talent for finding creative solutions to difficult problems, regardless of whether those solutions happen to be ethical, legal, or advisable. The Victorian era was a time of unprecedented change. The Industrial Revolution had transformed England from a largely agricultural society into an urban, mechanised powerhouse. The population of London alone grew from about 1 million at the start of the 19th century to over 6 million by its end. That's 6 million people who needed to eat, drink, and find small pleasures in lives that were often defined by grueling work and cramped living conditions. This created both a massive demand and a massive opportunity. Demand for cheap food that could be purchased quickly and consumed on the go. Demand for treats and luxuries that cost pennies rather than shillings. An opportunity for anyone clever enough or unscrupulous enough to figure out how to meet that demand while maximising their profit margins. Here's where, there were laws against certain things, technically. Ancient statutes dating back to medieval times prohibited selling corrupt or unwholesome food, but enforcement was practically non-existent. There was no food inspection agency, no ingredient labels, no regulatory body checking whether the contents of a jar matched what was written on the outside. The phrase buyer beware wasn't just a suggestion, it was the entire operating philosophy of the food trade. Into this regulatory vacuum stepped an army of entrepreneurs, and I use that term in the loosest possible sense. These were the food manufacturers, wholesalers and retailers who realised that in a market where no one was checking and everyone was competing on price, there was serious money to be made by. Let's call it creative ingredient management. The logic was brutally simple. Suppose you're making sweets. Real sugar costs money. Real fruit costs even more money. Natural colouring agents from plants and minerals? Expensive and inconsistent. But you're selling to people who earn pennies per day, people who can't afford to be choosy, people who just want something colourful and sweet to make their children smile. If you can make that product for half the cost by substituting cheaper ingredients, you can either pocket the extra profit or undercut your competitors' prices and dominate the market. Either way, you win. And so the great game of Victorian food adulteration began. It wasn't a conspiracy exactly. There was no secret society of villainous confectioners meeting in dark basements to plot the poisoning of the working class. It was simply capitalism operating in the absence of oversight, human nature doing what human nature does when there are no consequences for cutting corners. Everyone was doing it, which meant anyone who didn't do it was at a competitive disadvantage. The race to the bottom had begun, and it was a race that would claim victims in ways both immediate and tragically slow. Let's start our journey into this world of culinary deception with something seemingly innocent. A piece of candy. Stand at any busy street corner in Victorian London, and you'll likely see a sweets vendor within moments. They're everywhere, these merchants of sugar and colour. Some operate from permanent stalls in the markets. Others push carts through residential neighbourhoods, ringing bells to announce their presence to eager children. Still others set up temporary shops near factory gates, schools and anywhere else they might find customers with a few spare coins and a craving for something sweet. The sweets they sell are a feast for the eyes. Hard candies in jewel tones, arranged in glass jars like precious gems. Soft toffees wrapped in paper twists. Lozenges stamped with pretty patterns. Sugar sticks in stripes of red and white. Comfits, small seeds or nuts coated in layer upon layer of coloured sugar. And the ever-popular penny licks, small portions of ice cream or frozen sugar water served in a glass that you'd lick clean and hand back to the vendor, who would use it again for the next customer without naturally washing it in between. But that's a hygiene issue we'll address later. For now, let's focus on what's actually in these treats. The first thing to understand is that Victorian confectioners had developed adulteration into something approaching an art form. These weren't crude operators dumping random substances into their products. They were, in their own twisted way, quite sophisticated. They understood the properties of different adulterants, which ones would stretch sugar without changing the texture too much, which colorants would hold up to heat, which fillers would dissolve properly. Let's begin with the foundation of any sweet, the sugar itself. Pure cane sugar was expensive, especially before the repeal of the sugar duties in the 1850s. So confectioners learned to stretch it with cheaper alternatives. Glucose syrup derived from starch was one relatively harmless option, but others went further. They'd add gypsum, yes, the same substance used to make plaster of Paris, to bulk out their sugar supplies. Some particularly bold operators used ground glass, which had the advantage of being both cheap and virtually invisible once mixed with sugar crystals. The texture of your candy, in other words, might owe as much to building materials as to anything you'd actually want in your mouth. And we haven't even gotten to the really dangerous stuff yet. Because the true horror of Victorian sweets wasn't so much the fillers as the colours. In a competitive marketplace where appearance was everything, the ability to produce brilliantly coloured candies was a significant advantage. Customers, especially children, were drawn to bright, vivid hues. They associated intense colours with intense flavours. A deep red candy must taste powerfully of strawberry or cherry. A bright yellow treat obviously contained lemon. A green sweet was surely flavoured with refreshing mint. This association between colour and flavour was, of course, exactly what the confectioners were counting on, because in most cases the colour had absolutely nothing to do with the flavour. Both were artificial, and both were achieved through the cheapest possible means. Let's talk about red, since it was one of the most popular colours for Victorian sweets. To achieve that beautiful crimson or scarlet shade, confectioners had several options at their disposal. The safest, though still not exactly healthy by modern standards, was cochineal, a dye derived from crushed insects. Yes, cochineal comes from a scale insect native to Central and South America, and it's still used today in some food products, though now it has to be listed on the label, which takes some of the fun out of eating bug-based colorants. But cochineal was relatively expensive. A much cheaper alternative was vermilion, which sounds like a lovely romantic word until you realize it's another name for mercuric sulfide, a compound of mercury, that famously toxic element that also gave us the phrase mad as a hatter. Some confectioners used red lead, also called minium, which was even cheaper and provided a gorgeous orangey red colour that practically glowed. Red lead, for those keeping track at home, is a compound of lead oxide that's been used since ancient Roman times as a pigment. The Romans, however, had the good sense to use it primarily for painting buildings rather than for decorating food. The Victorians, in their infinite wisdom, decided it would look lovely on candy. Yellow was achieved through similar methods. Chrome yellow, also known as lead chromate, was a favourite choice. This brilliant pigment was also used in oil paints, notably by the artists of the period, some of whom developed interesting health problems as a result of their prolonged exposure to it. But at least painters weren't deliberately putting it in their mouths. The same cannot be said for the thousands of children who consumed chrome yellow-coloured sweets every day across Victorian England. Gambug was another yellow option, derived from the resin of trees in Southeast Asia. This was less toxic than lead chromate, but it had a significant drawback. It was also a powerful laxative. Some might argue that this was actually a feature rather than a bug, given that it would help expel the other toxins in the candy from your system more quickly. A sort of built-in purging mechanism, if you will. Nature's way of saying, maybe don't eat that. Green sweets presented their own special challenges and solutions. The obvious choice for creating a nice emerald hue was copper-based pigments, and indeed many green candies contained verdigris, the greenish patina that forms on copper when it's exposed to air and moisture. Verdigris is copper acetate, and while it won't kill you as quickly as lead, it's certainly not something you want to consume in quantity. Symptoms of copper poisoning include nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain, all of which the Victorians simply attributed to eating too many sweets, which was technically accurate if not quite in the way they imagined. For really vivid greens, some confectioners turned to an even more dramatic option: emerald green, also known as Paris green, also known as copper astaursonite. This gorgeous pigment was used for everything from wallpaper to artificial flowers to, yes, candy. It contained both copper and arsenic, making it a sort of 2-for-1 deal in terms of toxic exposure. The fact that it was also used as an insecticide and a rat poison should perhaps have given someone pause, but in the unregulated wonderland of Victorian food production, such considerations were apparently beside the point. Blue was less common in sweets but still appeared occasionally, often achieved through the use of Prussian blue, a compound that's actually one of the less toxic options, though that's not exactly a ringing endorsement. Purple and violet shades might come from orchil, a dye derived from lichens or from synthetic alternatives that were increasingly available as the century progressed and the chemical industry developed new products. So there you have it, a rainbow, and we haven't even discussed the flavouring yet. And just as the colours rarely came from natural sources, the flavours were equally artificial. Real fruit was expensive, seasonal, and difficult to preserve. Chemical essences, on the other hand, were cheap, consistent, and available year-round. Victorian confectioners had access to a growing range of artificial flavourings produced by the emerging chemical industry. Some of these were relatively harmless, early versions of the same artificial flavours we still use today, but others were considerably more questionable. Bitter almond flavouring, for instance, was popular for certain types of sweets. The compound that creates this distinctive taste is benzaldehyde, which occurs naturally in bitter almonds but is also closely related to prussic acid, better known as hydrogen cyanide. The naturally occurring version found in bitter almonds contains trace amounts of this poison, which is why eating large quantities of bitter almonds can actually kill you. The artificial versions were somewhat safer, but somewhat safer than actual poison is perhaps not the quality standard we should aspire to in our confectionery. Ethers and oils of various kinds were used to create fruit flavors without any actual fruit involvement. These were the least of the problems, honestly. If the only issue with Victorian sweets had been artificial flavoring, we'd barely have a story to tell. But combined with the toxic colors, the dubious fillers, and the general lack of sanitary conditions in production, they were just one more ingredient in a recipe for slow-motion public health disaster. Let's talk about that production for a moment, because the conditions under which Victorian sweets were manufactured would make a modern food safety inspector spontaneously combust. Most confectionery in this era was produced in small workshops, often located in the back rooms of shops or in the cramped quarters of residential buildings. Ventilation was minimal. Hygiene standards were effectively non-existent. The same hands that handled coal for the stove might, moments later, be rolling out candy. The same surfaces that served as workbenches might also serve as dining tables, sleeping platforms, or storage areas for non-food items. Rats and insects had essentially free access to ingredients and finished products alike, though to be fair, the toxic colorants probably took care of some of the pest problem naturally. Workers in these establishments, many of them children, were exposed to dangerous substances on a daily basis. They breathed in dust from lead-based pigments and arsenical greens. They handled toxic compounds without any protective equipment. Such equipment hadn't been invented yet, and even if it had, it certainly wouldn't have been provided to workers in a penny candy shop. The effects of this exposure accumulated over time, leading to chronic health problems that were rarely traced back to their occupational source. And the products of these workshops went directly into the mouths of consumers, with no inspection, no testing, and no oversight of any kind. If a batch of sweets came out looking a bit odd or tasting slightly off, well, that was the vendor's problem, not the consumer's. The vendor might discard it, or might simply sell it at a discount to customers too poor to be choosy. Nothing was wasted, even if consuming it meant wasting your health in return. The consumers of these products were predominantly working class. Wealthier Victorians had access to higher quality confectionery, sweets made with actual sugar, coloured with relatively safer dyes, and flavoured with real ingredients. But such luxuries were far beyond the reach of most people. The average factory worker, earning perhaps 15 shillings a week, could not afford to spend precious coins on artisanal chocolates. They bought what they could afford, which meant buying from vendors who sold cheap, which meant buying products that had been adulterated to keep costs down. Children were particularly vulnerable consumers of these toxic treats. Sweets were one of the few affordable pleasures available to working-class kids in Victorian England. Parents who could spare a penny or two would often send their children to the sweet shop as a treat after a hard week. Street vendors knew this and deliberately set up shop near schools, playgrounds, and factory gates where young workers might be found. The bright colours and low prices were designed to appeal to young customers who had no way of knowing that the pretty red candy they craved contained lead, or that the green lozenge they loved was laced with arsenic. The effects of this exposure varied depending on the specific adulterants involved and the quantity consumed. Lead poisoning from the various lead-based colorants could cause a range of symptoms: abdominal pain, constipation, headaches, irritability, and loss of appetite. In severe cases, it could damage the nervous system, leading to seizures, cognitive impairment, and death. But lead poisoning is often slow and insidious, its symptoms vague and easily attributed to other causes. A child who complained of stomach aches after eating sweets might simply be told they'd had too many, and the admonition to moderate their consumption was, ironically, the best health advice they could have received. Arsenic poisoning from the green copper acetoarsenite pigments presented more dramatic symptoms. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and severe abdominal pain could occur after consuming even moderate quantities. Chronic exposure led to skin changes, peripheral neuropathy, and increased risk of cancer. But again, these symptoms were not unique to arsenic poisoning and could easily be mistaken for other common ailments of the era: cholera, typhoid, or simply bad stomach. Mercury from the vermilion used in red sweets attacked the nervous system. Tremors, personality changes, and cognitive decline were all potential consequences. The Mad Hatter of Victorian England wasn't a fictional character, but a real occupational hazard for workers in the hat-making industry who were exposed to mercury compounds. The same fate, in a slower and more diffuse form, awaited consumers who regularly ingested mercury-contaminated food. And then there were the acute poisoning incidents, cases where the level of adulteration was so extreme, or the batch of adulterant so toxic, that the effects were immediate and unmistakable. The most notorious of these occurred in Bradford in 1858, an incident that would eventually help spark the movement for food safety reform. But before we get to that particular tragedy, and tragedy it was, let's understand that it was not an isolated event but rather the visible peak of an iceberg of poisoning that had been growing beneath the surface for decades. Throughout the 1840s and 50s, doctors across England had been noticing suspicious patterns. Children who developed symptoms of lead poisoning without any obvious source of exposure, patient clusters of illness that seemed connected to particular vendors or particular products, though the connections were difficult to prove in an era before systematic public health surveillance. Some physicians began to speak out about their suspicions. Dr. Arthur Hill Hassell, whose work we'll explore in more detail later, was conducting pioneering analyses of food products and publishing the disturbing results. But his findings were dismissed by many as alarmist, and the trade in adulterated food continued unabated. The sweets trade was not, of course, the only sector affected by these practices. Bread was adulterated with alum to make it whiter and with chalk to increase its weight. Milk was diluted with water and coloured with chalk or worse to disguise the dilution. Tea was padded with dried leaves from other plants and coloured with various pigments. Coffee was extended with chicory, acorns, and sometimes dirt. Beer was doctored with everything from salt to Cocculus indicus, a toxic berry used to make weak beer seem stronger. The entire food supply was, in effect, a massive game of consumer deception, with the stakes being the health and lives of the buying public. But sweets held a special place in this landscape of fraud for several reasons. First, they were consumed primarily by children, a particularly vulnerable population. Second, the emphasis on bright colours meant that toxic pigments were used in higher concentrations than in other products. Third, sweets were pure indulgence. They weren't eaten to satisfy hunger or provide nutrition, but simply for pleasure. This made their dangers seem particularly cruel and unnecessary. You could perhaps understand, if not forgive, the adulteration of bread that fed hungry families. But poisoning children's candy for a few extra pennies of profit, that was a different order of moral failing. The economics of the sweets trade also created particular incentives for dangerous practices. Confectionery was a low-margin business selling to price-sensitive customers. The difference between profit and loss might come down to fractions of a penny per item. In such an environment, any opportunity to reduce costs, even at the expense of customer safety, was tempting. And since everyone else was doing it, the confectioner who refused to adulterate was simply the confectioner who went out of business. This was the logic of the race to the bottom, and it had been accelerating for decades by the time the Bradford tragedy brought it to public attention. But understanding that logic doesn't make its consequences any less horrifying. Let's spend some time now with the vendors who sold these products, because they occupied a peculiar moral position in this whole system. Were they villains, knowingly poisoning their customers for profit? Were they victims themselves, caught up in a system they didn't create and couldn't escape? The answer, as with most things involving human beings, is complicated. Many street vendors and small shopkeepers had little idea what was actually in the products they sold. They bought their stock from wholesalers and manufacturers, trusting, to the extent they thought about it at all, that the products were what they claimed to be. A vendor selling penny candies on a street corner wasn't conducting chemical analyses in a back room. They simply purchased whatever was cheapest and looked appealing, then passed it on to their customers. The profit margins were thin enough that asking too many questions about ingredients would have been economically suicidal. This ignorance wasn't complete, of course. Many vendors knew at some level that the intensely coloured sweets they sold were probably not coloured with fruit juice. They knew that sugar prices fluctuated, but their suppliers' prices remained suspiciously stable. They may even have heard rumours about lead and arsenic and other dangerous substances. But knowledge is a spectrum, and most people are quite skilled at not knowing things they'd rather not know, especially when their livelihood depends on that ignorance. Manufacturers and wholesalers occupied a more clearly culpable position. These were the people who actually decided what went into the products. They purchased the toxic colorants, mixed them with the sugar and fillers, and created the items that would eventually reach consumers. They had to know, at some level, that what they were doing was harmful. The very fact that they didn't advertise their methods, that no candy shop displayed a sign saying "now with extra lead for that beautiful red colour," suggests an awareness that the public would not approve if they knew the truth. But even here, the picture is complicated by the standards of the time. Many adulterants that we now recognise as clearly dangerous were not understood as such in the Victorian era. The germ theory of disease was only beginning to gain acceptance. The concepts of chronic toxicity and cumulative exposure were poorly developed. A substance might be known as a poison in large doses while still being considered acceptable in small amounts. Moreover, the entire system was structured to diffuse responsibility. The manufacturer bought pigments from chemical suppliers who didn't ask what they would be used for. The wholesaler bought finished products from manufacturers without inquiring about specific ingredients. The retailer bought from wholesalers on the basis of price and appearance. And the customer bought from retailers without any way to test or verify what they were getting. Everyone could point to someone else in the chain and say, "Not my responsibility," and in a sense, everyone was right. The system itself was the problem, and no individual actor felt empowered or incentivized to change it. This is one of the fascinating and tragic aspects of studying historical food adulteration. It wasn't a matter of a few bad actors operating outside the norms of their society. It was a systemic problem built into the economic and regulatory structures of the time. The people involved weren't for the most part cartoon villains twirling their moustaches as they plotted to poison children. They were ordinary people operating within a system that rewarded harmful behaviour and punished ethical conduct. That doesn't absolve them of responsibility, but it does help explain how such widespread harm could persist for so long without effective opposition. The consumers, meanwhile, were largely helpless. They had no way to test the products they bought. They had no regulatory agency to complain to. They had little or no legal recourse against vendors who sold them adulterated goods. And perhaps most importantly, they often had no alternatives. When you're earning barely enough to survive, you buy what you can afford and you hope for the best. The luxury of choosing safer, more expensive options is not available to those living on the edge of poverty. This economic coercion was one of the cruelest aspects of Victorian food adulteration. The wealthiest members of society who could afford premium products from reputable vendors were largely insulated from the worst dangers. It was the poor who bore the brunt of the poisoning: the factory workers, the domestic servants, the street children, the families crowded into tenement housing. The same economic system that forced them into grinding poverty also forced them to consume the most dangerous food. It was in effect a tax on being poor, paid not in money but in health and years of life. Let's return now to that Victorian street market where we began and see it with new eyes. The colours are still beautiful, the aromas still enticing, but now we know what lurks behind the beauty. That bright red candy contains lead. That green lozenge is laced with arsenic. That golden toffee has been stretched with gypsum and flavoured with chemicals. The vendor's smile is genuine. He needs to make a living too, but the products he sells are silent threats wrapped in coloured paper. A mother stops at the sweet stall, her young daughter tugging at her skirt. The child points to a jar of brilliant red drops, their colour so vivid they seem to glow in the fading light. "Please, Mama, just one." The mother hesitates. Money is tight, as it always is. But the pleading in her daughter's eyes is hard to resist, and what harm can one small sweet do? She hands over a penny and watches her daughter pop the candy into her mouth, her face lighting up with simple pleasure. The mother doesn't know, can't know, that she has just given her child a tiny dose of poison. One sweet won't cause obvious harm. But this scene is repeated daily, weekly, throughout the childhood. The doses accumulate. The lead builds up in bones and brain. The effects are subtle at first, easy to attribute to other causes. But they're real, and they're permanent, and they're entirely preventable, if only anyone in authority cared enough to prevent them. This was the reality of the Victorian sweet shop. Not a place of innocent indulgence, but a node in a vast network of adulteration and deception. The pretty colours were lies, the fruity flavours were fabrications, and the prices that seemed like such a bargain came with hidden costs that wouldn't be apparent for years, if ever. But as the 1850s drew toward their close, the situation was about to change. The Bradford poisoning of 1858 would shock the nation, and force even the most complacent observers to confront the reality of what was being sold as food. Crusade journalists would take up the cause, and eventually, reluctantly, Parliament would be forced to act. The age of unregulated food adulteration was approaching its end, not quickly, and not without fierce resistance from those who profited from the status quo, but inexorably. The Victorian public was about to wake up to what had been hiding in plain sight all along, that the food supply they depended on was compromised at every level, and that changing this would require a fundamental transformation in how society thought about the relationship between commerce, safety, and the public good. But that transformation was still in the future. For now, on this autumn evening in 1857, the markets are still open, the vendors are still selling, and the sweets are still glowing in their jars like jewels. Beautiful, tempting, and deadly. The child with the red candy skips alongside her mother as they head for home, the sweet dissolving slowly in her mouth, its artificial flavour filling her senses with what she imagines is the taste of strawberries. She'll be back next week if her mother can spare another penny. They both will, and so will thousands of other families all across England, in a daily ritual of innocent consumption and invisible harm. The great machine of Victorian food adulteration grinds on, converting human health into profits 1 penny at a time. The reckoning is coming, but it hasn't arrived yet. Tonight the sweets are still sweet, and the colours are still bright, and the truth remains hidden behind the beautiful facade of the marketplace. So let's pause here for a moment and talk about what it was like to actually make these sweets, because the production process tells us as much about Victorian society as the consumption does. Imagine a small workshop in a working-class neighbourhood of London. The room is perhaps 12 feet by 15, with a low ceiling stained by years of coal smoke and sugar steam. Against one wall sits a coal-fired stove, its surface covered with copper pans of various sizes. A battered wooden table dominates the centre of the room, its surface permanently scarred and sticky from years of candy making. Shelves along the walls hold jars of ingredients. Sugar, of course, but also an array of powders and liquids whose purposes are not immediately apparent to the uninitiated eye. The confectioner himself is a man in his 40s, though he looks older. His hands are red and rough from constant exposure to hot sugar. His face has a greyish pallor that might be attributed to the coal smoke, but probably owes something to his daily contact with lead-based pigments. He learned this trade from his father, who learned it from his father, and the recipes he uses have been passed down through generations, including, unfortunately, the adulteration techniques that make them profitable. Working alongside him is his wife and 3 of his children, the oldest of whom is 11. The children's primary job is to wrap the finished sweets in paper twists, but they also help with mixing ingredients, stirring pots, and cleaning up. They work from early morning until late at night, because candy making is labour-intensive and the margins are thin. A day of rest means a day without income, and a day without income means a day closer to the workhouse. This workshop represents the majority of Victorian confectionery production. There were some larger factories, certainly, especially as the century progressed and industrialisation spread into more sectors of the economy. But most sweets were still made in small-scale operations like this one, family businesses operating on minimal capital and maximal labour. The lack of scale meant limited bargaining power with suppliers, which meant paying top prices for ingredients, which meant finding ways to cut costs elsewhere. Let's follow the production of a batch of red sugar drops, the kind that the little girl bought in our earlier scene. The confectioner begins with sugar, not pure cane sugar, which would eat too far into his profits, but a mixture of sugar and glucose syrup, the latter being cheaper and also easier to work with. To this mixture he adds a small quantity of gypsum powder, which adds weight and bulk without significantly affecting the taste or texture. The mixture goes into a copper pan over the fire, where it's stirred constantly as it heats. The stirring is critical. Stop for a moment and the sugar will burn, ruining the batch. The confectioner's wife takes over this task while he prepares the colouring. From a jar on the shelf he measures out a portion of red lead powder, a beautiful orange-red substance that will give the finished sweets their attractive colour. He mixes this with a small amount of water to form a paste, then sets it aside. When the sugar mixture reaches the right temperature, determined by years of experience rather than any thermometer, it's poured onto a greased marble slab to cool. As it cools, the colouring is worked into it, the confectioner kneading and folding the mass until the colour is evenly distributed. This is the most dangerous part of the process in terms of the confectioner's own exposure. He's working the lead paste with his bare hands, breathing in whatever dust is released, absorbing the poison through his skin with every fold and knead. The flavour is concentrated enough that it needs to be added sparingly. Too much, and it will overwhelm the sugar, turning pleasure into unpleasantness. Once the colour and flavour are evenly distributed, the mass is divided into portions and rolled into long ropes, which are then cut into individual drops. The still warm drops are rolled between the palms to give them a uniform shape, then set aside to cool completely. Once cool, they're dusted with powdered sugar to prevent sticking and transferred to jars for sale. The entire process takes several hours and produces perhaps 5 pounds of finished sweets. These will sell for a few pennies per ounce, generating a modest profit that will be spent on rent, food, coal, and the raw materials for tomorrow's batch. It's not a lucrative business, but it's a living built on the slow poisoning of customers who have no way of knowing what they're buying. The confectioner doesn't think of himself as a poisoner, of course. He thinks of himself as a businessman, a craftsman, a family man doing what's necessary to survive. The lead in his sweets is simply an ingredient, no different morally from the sugar or the flavoring. Everyone uses it. His father used it. His competitors use it. The suppliers who sell it don't warn him against using it. In his mind, he's not doing anything wrong. He's just doing what's done. This psychological distance between action and consequence is one of the features of systemic harm that makes it so difficult to address. When harm is immediate and obvious, the moral responsibility is clear. If the confectioner were to personally force-feed lead to children, he would understand himself to be committing a crime. But when the harm is mediated through products, markets, and time, when the connection between the red lead he adds and the sick children who consume it is invisible and diffuse, the moral weight seems to disappear. We see this same phenomenon in many contexts today, from environmental pollution to financial fraud. The structures that separate actors from the consequences of their actions create space for harm to flourish, without anyone feeling personally responsible. The Victorian confectioner was neither better nor worse than most people. He was simply operating within a system that had normalized poisoning and made it invisible. His children, working alongside him in the workshop, were doubly victimized by this system. They were exposed to toxic substances in the course of their labor, absorbing lead and arsenic and copper compounds through daily contact. And they consumed the products of that labor, eating the sweets that were their family's livelihood and their occasional treat. The confectioner's own children were being slowly poisoned by their father's work, and he had no idea, or if he had some inkling, no way to acknowledge it without calling into question his entire way of life. This is the tragedy at the heart of Victorian food adulteration. It wasn't just that unscrupulous manufacturers poisoned innocent consumers. It was that the entire system was toxic, from production to consumption, from the chemical suppliers to the street vendors to the children buying penny sweets. Everyone was caught in a web of mutual harm, and the threads of that web were made of economic necessity, regulatory failure, and the human capacity for self-deception. As we move forward in our story, we'll see how this web began to unravel. We'll meet the scientists who first documented the extent of adulteration, the journalists who brought it to public attention, and the reformers who pushed for legislative change. We'll witness the Bradford poisoning and its aftermath, the debates in Parliament, and the slow, grudging emergence of food safety regulation. But we'll also see how resistant the system was to change, how fiercely those who profited from adulteration fought against reform, and how long it took for effective protections to be put in place. The story of Victorian food safety is not a simple tale of good triumphing over evil. It's a complex narrative of competing interests, incremental progress, and the grinding difficulty of making systemic change, even when the harm being prevented is as obvious as poisoned children. For now, though, let's remain in this moment. The late 1850s, the eve of change, the last days of the unregulated marketplace. The sweets are still glowing in their jars. The vendors are still calling their wares. And somewhere in Bradford, a shipment of lozenges is being prepared that will change everything. That shipment contained what the manufacturer called daft, a mixture of gypsum and other fillers used to stretch sugar and reduce costs. But this particular batch of daft was not what it seemed. Through a series of mistakes, miscommunications, and the kind of carelessness that becomes inevitable in an unregulated industry, the substance delivered to the sweet manufacturer was not gypsum, but arsenic trioxide. White, powdery, and virtually indistinguishable from the legitimate filler. The sweets made with this adulterated daft were sold at a market in Bradford on a Saturday in October 1858. By Monday, people were dying. By the time the outbreak was contained, more than 20 people were dead, and over 200 were seriously ill, most of them children, most of them from poor families, all of them victims of a system that had valued profits over lives for far too long. But that is a story for another chapter. For now, let the Victorian marketplace remain suspended in this amber moment, beautiful and deadly, a snapshot of an era when you truly couldn't trust what you ate, when every bright colour might be a poison in disguise, and when the simple pleasure of a sweet was tangled up with dangers that most consumers could never have imagined. The night is growing late, and the market stalls are beginning to close. The vendors pack away their unsold wares, counting the day's take by candlelight. Somewhere, a child falls asleep with the taste of artificial strawberries still on her tongue, unaware of the tiny battle being fought in her body between her natural defences and the lead she's just consumed. Tomorrow, if she's lucky and her exposure hasn't accumulated too far, she'll wake up feeling fine. She'll beg for another sweet, and if fortune smiles, she'll get one. The wheel of Victorian commerce keeps turning, grinding out pennies and pounds and profits, grinding up health and safety and trust. But the wheel is about to hit a stone that will shake its axle and threaten to throw it off its course. The reckoning is coming. Change is on the horizon, barely visible but approaching, and we'll be here to watch it arrive. But for now, rest easy in the knowledge that at least you know what's in your midnight snack. The Victorians weren't so fortunate, but their misfortune, their suffering, their deaths, their eventual outrage, would lay the groundwork for the food safety systems we take for granted today. Every regulation, every ingredient label, every food inspector draws a line back to these poisoned sweets and the people who finally said enough. Their story deserves to be remembered, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a reminder of what happens when markets are left entirely to regulate themselves and what it takes to build something better. So that's where we are, on the cusp of change, in a marketplace of beautiful dangers, with the Bradford tragedy waiting just around the corner. The sweets are still sweet, and the colours are still bright, and the cost of a penny candy is still measured in more than just coins. Now, if you thought the sweets were bad, and they absolutely were, let's turn our attention to something even more fundamental. Something that sat at the very centre of Victorian life, the one food item that no household, rich or poor, could do without. We're talking about bread. The staff of life. The cornerstone of every meal. The thing that separated mere hunger from actual starvation for millions of working families across England. Bread in Victorian England wasn't just food, it was survival itself. A working-class family might spend anywhere from half to 3/4 of their entire income on bread alone. When bread prices rose, people starved. When bread was scarce, riots broke out. The importance of bread to social stability was so well understood that the government kept a nervous eye on wheat prices the way modern governments watch unemployment figures. Bread was politics. Bread was economics. Bread was quite literally life and death, which makes what the bakers were doing to it all the more remarkable. Because Victorian bread, that essential foundation of daily existence, was perhaps the most systematically adulterated food product in the entire marketplace. The loaf you bought from your local baker, assuming you could afford to buy rather than bake your own, was almost certainly not what it appeared to be. That beautiful white crumb, that satisfying heft, that appealing texture, all of it was, to use a technical term, a complete fabrication. Let's start with the most famous adulterant, alum. If you've never heard of alum, don't worry. There's no particular reason you would have, unless you happen to work in the leather tanning industry, or you're really into pickling vegetables, or you have an unusual interest in Victorian baking scandals. Alum is potassium aluminum sulfate, a chemical compound with a variety of industrial uses. It's excellent for fixing dyes to fabric. It's useful in water purification. It makes pickles crisper and helps preserve fruit. And, as Victorian bakers discovered to their considerable profit, it makes bread whiter. This matters because whiteness in bread had become deeply associated with quality and purity. The whiter your bread, the more refined you were presumed to be. Brown bread was peasant food, the stuff of rural poverty and backward simplicity. White bread was aspirational. It signalled that you had risen above mere subsistence, that you could afford the finer things, that you belonged to a better class of person. Never mind that brown bread was actually more nutritious. Never mind that the whole wheat flour it was made from contained fibre and vitamins that white flour lacked. In Victorian England, white was right, and every baker knew it. The problem was that truly white bread required truly white flour, and truly white flour was expensive. Properly milled, properly refined white flour cost significantly more than the coarser grades. And since bakers were competing fiercely on price, remember bread was the one product that every customer needed, and that every competitor was trying to sell, there was intense pressure to find ways to make bread look white without paying for white flour. Enter alum. Add a small quantity to your dough and something magical happens. The bread comes out whiter, even if you're using cheaper, less refined flour. The crumb has a finer texture. The loaf rises better and looks more attractive. To the casual consumer, a loaf made with alum looked like a premium product, even though the base ingredients were decidedly economy class. The economics were irresistible. A baker using alum could purchase cheaper flour, sell bread that looked just as good as his competitors' premium loaves, and pocket the difference. Or he could undercut his competitors on price while maintaining the appearance of quality. Either way, the alum gave him a significant advantage in a marketplace where appearance was everything, and no one was checking what actually went into the dough. But alum wasn't just a cosmetic additive. It had other properties that made it even more attractive to unscrupulous bakers. Alum absorbs water, quite a lot of water actually. A dough made with alum could hold more water without becoming soggy, which meant that the baker could sell what was essentially water at bread prices. A loaf that should have weighed 2 pounds might contain enough extra water to tip the scales at 2¼ and the customer would never know the difference. They'd just think they were getting a particularly moist, fresh loaf. This water-binding property also meant that alum-laced bread stayed soft longer. Normal bread begins to go stale within a day or two, as the starches crystallize and the moisture redistributes. But bread made with alum maintained its soft texture for longer, which meant less waste for the baker and the illusion of freshness for the customer. Again, everyone wins, except for the people actually eating the stuff. Because here's the thing about alum, it's not exactly good for you. In small quantities, it's probably not acutely harmful. You're not going to keel over from eating one slice of alum-adulterated bread. But chronic consumption is another matter. Alum is an astringent, which means it causes tissues to contract. In the digestive system, this can lead to constipation, irritation of the gut lining, and impaired absorption of nutrients. Regular consumption has been linked to digestive problems, weakness, and general ill health. There's also the small matter of the aluminum. We now know that aluminum accumulates in the body and has been associated with various health concerns, though the exact nature and extent of these concerns remains a subject of scientific debate. The Victorians didn't know about this specific risk, but they didn't need to. The more immediate effects of alum were concerning enough for anyone paying attention, and yet the practice was absolutely ubiquitous. By the middle of the 19th century, it was estimated that virtually all commercially produced white bread in England contained alum. Not most of it, virtually all of it. The practice had become so standard that bakers who didn't use alum were at a severe competitive disadvantage. Their bread looked darker, weighed less, and went stale faster than their competitors. In a marketplace where customers judged quality by appearance, the honest baker was punished for his honesty. This is one of those situations where the phrase "race to the bottom" really earns its keep. Once adulteration becomes widespread enough, it stops being a competitive advantage and becomes a competitive necessity. The first bakers to use alum gained an edge over their honest competitors. But as the practice spread, that edge disappeared. Everyone was using alum, so no one had an advantage. Yet stopping would mean falling behind, so everyone kept doing it. The entire industry had locked itself into a pattern of behaviour that harmed consumers, but that no individual actor could escape without harming themselves more. But alum was far from the only substance making its way into Victorian bread. The quest for whiteness and weight led bakers to experiment with a whole pharmacopoeia of additives, some merely dishonest and some genuinely dangerous. Chalk was a popular choice, literally calcium carbonate, the same substance used to write on blackboards. Ground fine enough, chalk added whiteness and weight to flour without significantly affecting the taste or texture of the finished bread. The Victorian consumer, biting into their morning toast, might be ingesting what was essentially ground-up limestone, but at least limestone is relatively inert. It would pass through the digestive system without causing too much trouble, though it certainly wasn't providing any nutritional value beyond a small calcium supplement that no one had asked for. Plaster of Paris, calcium sulfate, was another option, similar in appearance and function to chalk. Mix it with your flour and your bread gains weight and whiteness at minimal cost. The fact that plaster of Paris was primarily used for making casts, moulds, and building materials apparently didn't give anyone pause. Or if it did, the pause was brief and easily overcome by the profit motive. Then there was bone ash. Yes, you read that correctly. Ground up bones, calcined until they turned into a fine white powder. Bone ash had legitimate uses in the ceramics industry, where it was a key ingredient in bone china. But it also found its way into flour mills and bakeries, where its whiteness and its ability to bulk out flour made it an attractive adulterant. The thought of consuming powdered bones might seem macabre, but the Victorians were nothing if not practical. Bones were a waste product of the meat industry, available cheaply in large quantities. Why let them go to waste when they could be turned into profit? Some bone ash was produced from the bones of cattle and sheep, which is unappetizing but at least comprehensible. But there were persistent rumours, never conclusively proven but never quite dispelled, that some of the bones making their way into the food supply came from less savoury sources. Bones from knackers' yards where dead horses and other animals were processed. Bones from graveyards, dug up by the body snatchers who supplied the medical schools, but who weren't above selling their excess inventory to the bone meal trade. Were human bones ever actually ground into flour and sold as bread? It's impossible to say for certain. The supply chains of Victorian adulterants were murky and poorly documented, but the fact that the question could even be asked, that it was plausible enough to worry about, tells you something about the state of the food supply. When you can't rule out the possibility that your breakfast toast contains traces of Great Uncle Henry, you've got a systemic problem on your hands. Beyond these bulk adulterants, there were other substances added to bread for various purposes. Potatoes, when cheap and plentiful, were sometimes mixed into dough as a filler. This was actually one of the more benign adulterations, as potatoes are perfectly edible and might even improve the texture of bread. Rice flour served a similar purpose and was similarly harmless. But other additives were more concerning. Some bakers used copper sulfate, yes, the same substance used as a fungicide and in various industrial processes, to give their bread a better colour and texture. Others experimented with various chemical whiteners and oxidizers, the exact nature of which was often known only to the suppliers who sold them. The bakers themselves frequently didn't know precisely what they were adding to their dough. They just knew that this powder made the bread whiter and that powder made it rise better, and asking too many questions wasn't good for business. The flour itself, before it even reached the baker, might already be adulterated. Millers had their own incentives to stretch their product, and flour was often bulked out with ground rice, potato starch, chalk, or various other substances before it was sold to bakers. A conscientious baker who wanted to produce honest bread would have found it nearly impossible to source unadulterated flour in the first place. The rot went all the way up the supply chain. Let's pause for a moment and consider what this meant for the average Victorian consumer. They're buying bread, the most fundamental food in their diet, the thing they eat at every meal, the food their children depend on for growth and sustenance. And this bread contains alum, which irritates their digestive system and impairs nutrient absorption. It contains chalk and plaster, which add weight but not nourishment. It may contain bone ash of dubious origin. It's made from flour that has itself been adulterated with who knows what. And there's absolutely nothing they can do about it, because every baker in town is doing the same thing, and there's no way to tell an adulterated loaf from an honest one just by looking at it. This was the everyday reality of Victorian food consumption. Not a single scandalous incident, but a constant grinding exposure to substances that had no business being in food. The effects were cumulative and largely invisible. A bit more digestive trouble, a bit less energy, a general sense of unwellness that could be attributed to any number of causes. The Victorians were, quite literally, being slowly undermined by their own food supply. And the bread was just the beginning. Now let's shift our perspective from the product to the consumer, and specifically to the context in which that consumer was eating. Because the story of Victorian food adulteration isn't just about what was in the food, it's about how people were eating, and how the industrial transformation of England changed the very nature of meals. Before the Industrial Revolution, most English people lived in rural areas and worked in agriculture or cottage industries. Meals were eaten at home, prepared by family members, consumed at a pace dictated by the rhythms of farm work and domestic life. Food might not have been abundant, and it certainly wasn't sophisticated, but it was generally made from recognizable ingredients by people you knew, and you had time to eat it properly. The factories changed all of that. The industrial system that transformed England into the workshop of the world also transformed how its workers ate. Factory work operated on schedules that had nothing to do with human hunger and everything to do with mechanical efficiency. The machines didn't stop for lunch, and neither could the workers who tended them. Meal breaks were short, grudgingly granted and rigidly enforced. You had perhaps 30 minutes to eat your midday meal, if you were lucky enough to get a break at all. This created an entirely new category of eating, food as fuel. The factory worker didn't sit down to a leisurely dinner. They crammed calories into their bodies as quickly as possible before returning to their stations. Nutrition, taste, and pleasure were secondary considerations. What mattered was efficiency, getting enough energy to make it through the shift without collapsing. The foods that thrived in this environment were, predictably, the cheapest and most portable ones. Bread, obviously. You could carry a chunk of bread in your pocket and gnaw on it between tasks. Cheese, if you could afford it, for the same reasons. Cold meat pies when available, which could be eaten with one hand while the other kept working. And sweets, those brightly coloured, dubiously adulterated confections we discussed earlier, which provided a quick burst of energy and a moment of pleasure in an otherwise grinding day. The rise of the factory lunch break created a whole new market for portable, ready-to-eat food. Street vendors set up shop near factory gates selling hot pies, fried fish, baked potatoes and other foods that could be consumed quickly and without utensils. These vendors competed fiercely on price, which meant they faced all the same pressures toward adulteration that we've already discussed. The pie you bought from a street seller outside a Manchester cotton mill was probably not made from prime cuts of meat, and the potato might be the only ingredient you could positively identify. The quality of these foods was, to put it mildly, variable. Street vendors operated entirely outside any regulatory framework. They bought their ingredients from the cheapest sources, prepared them under conditions that would make a modern health inspector faint, and sold them to customers who were too hungry and too hurried to ask questions. A hot pie was a hot pie. You ate it quickly and hoped for the best. Contemporary accounts of factory gate food are not encouraging. The pies were often described as containing more gristle than meat, padded out with breadcrumbs, potatoes, or less identifiable fillers. The gravy was thin, the pastry was heavy, and the whole thing sat in your stomach like a lead weight for the rest of the afternoon. But it was hot, it was filling, and it cost only a few pennies, which was all that most workers could afford. The fried fish sold by street vendors was somewhat better. Fish was abundant and cheap in England, and it's hard to disguise a piece of fish the way you can disguise the contents of a pie. But the oil it was fried in might be reused until it was practically solid, and the fish might include specimens that a more discerning buyer would have rejected. Still, fried fish provided protein and fat, both crucial for workers burning thousands of calories per day through physical labour. Perhaps the most telling sign of how industrialization changed eating habits was the rise of the tea break. Tea had been a luxury drink, imported at great expense from China, but falling prices in the 19th century made it affordable for working-class families, and tea was perfectly suited to the industrial workplace. It could be brewed quickly, consumed hot or cold, and provided a jolt of caffeine that helped workers stay alert through long shifts. The ritual of the tea break, still sacred in British workplaces to this day, was born in the factories of Victorian England. But tea alone doesn't provide much in the way of nutrition. It was typically consumed with sugar, lots of sugar, which provided quick energy but not much else. Workers would gulp down cups of heavily sweetened tea between shifts, getting a burst of energy that would carry them through the next few hours. The sugar trade boomed alongside the tea trade, and the combination of the two became the default fuel of the industrial working class. This diet of bread, cheap pies, and sweet tea had predictable consequences. Nutritional deficiencies were rampant among factory workers and their families. Rickets caused by lack of vitamin D and calcium was endemic among children in industrial cities, where smoke-darkened skies blocked what little sunlight might have helped their bodies produce the necessary vitamins. Scurvy, which we tend to associate with sailors on long voyages, appeared in urban populations who had little access to fresh fruits and vegetables. Anemia was common, especially among women and children due to diets lacking in iron-rich foods. The irony was painful. England's factories were producing wealth on an unprecedented scale, transforming the nation into a global economic powerhouse. But the workers who powered those factories were being systematically malnourished, their bodies depleted by diets that provided calories but not nutrition. They were, in a very real sense, being consumed by the system that consumed their labour. Factory owners, it must be said, were generally not concerned about the nutritional status of their workers. As long as production continued, as long as the machines kept running and the goods kept shipping, what did it matter if the workers were tired, sick, or slowly breaking down? Labour was cheap and abundant. If one worker collapsed, there were 10 more desperate for a job. The economic logic of the factory system had no category for worker welfare, no column in the ledger for human flourishing. Some of the more enlightened factory owners did attempt to improve conditions for their workers, including their access to decent food. Robert Owen's model community at New Lanark in Scotland included a company store that sold unadulterated provisions at fair prices, and other progressive industrialists followed his example. But these were the exceptions. The majority of factory workers had to fend for themselves in a marketplace designed to extract maximum profit from minimum input. The homes to which these workers returned after their shifts were not much better equipped for proper nutrition. Working-class housing in industrial cities was cramped, overcrowded and poorly equipped. Many families lived in single rooms with no separate kitchen and only a small fire for both heating and cooking. Preparing elaborate meals under these conditions was practically impossible, even if the ingredients had been affordable and available. The same industrial economy that employed men in factories also drew women into paid labour, in textile mills, in domestic service, in 100 different occupations that took them away from home for most of the day. A working mother had no time to prepare meals from scratch. She relied on prepared foods, street vendors, and whatever quick solutions she could manage between shifts. The children of working mothers often ate whatever was cheapest and easiest: bread and treacle, bread and dripping, or just bread alone. Treacle, by the way, was the thick syrup left over from sugar refining, a cheap source of sweetness that was widely used in working-class cooking. Dripping was the fat rendered from roasting meat, saved and spread on bread as a cheap substitute for butter. These were the staples of the industrial working-class diet: bread with something on it, tea with sugar in it, and whatever else could be scraped together when money allowed. The timing of meals shifted too. Traditional rural patterns of breakfast, dinner at midday, and supper in the evening gave way to schedules dictated by factory shifts. Workers might eat their main meal at odd hours, whenever their shift happened to end. Families rarely ate together. Different family members worked different shifts, came and went at different times, grabbed food when they could. The communal meal, that ancient ritual of human society, became a luxury that many working families simply couldn't afford. This fragmentation of eating had social consequences beyond nutrition. Meals had traditionally been moments of family gathering, of conversation and connection, of passing down stories and values from one generation to the next. When meals became isolated acts of refueling, each family member grabbing food separately before rushing off to work or bed, something was lost that couldn't be measured in calories or vitamins. Children suffered most from this new pattern of eating. Working-class children in Victorian England were often left to feed themselves while their parents laboured. They ate what they could find or afford: penny sweets from street vendors, scraps from market stalls, whatever their older siblings could provide. The concept of a balanced diet for growing children was simply not part of the working-class reality. Children ate what was available, which usually meant bread, sugar, and not much else. The health consequences were visible on the streets of any industrial city. Working-class children were, on average, significantly shorter than their middle-class counterparts, a direct result of nutritional deficiency during crucial growth years. They were more susceptible to disease, quicker to tire, slower to recover from illness. The stunted, pale, hollow-eyed factory children who populate Victorian novels and reform pamphlets were not literary exaggerations. They were accurate descriptions of what malnutrition and overwork actually looked like. This is the context in which we need to understand Victorian food adulteration. It wasn't just that the food was contaminated with dangerous substances, though it certainly was. It was that the entire system of food production, distribution, and consumption had been warped by the demands of industrial capitalism. Food had become a commodity like any other, subject to the same pressures of cost-cutting and profit-maximizing that governed the production of cloth or iron. And the people most harmed by this transformation were the ones who could least afford to protect themselves. The wealthy could shop at reputable establishments that charged premium prices for quality goods. They could hire cooks who knew how to identify fresh ingredients and prepare nutritious meals. They had the time to eat properly and the resources to maintain their health. Food adulteration was not primarily their problem. But for the working class, there was no escape. Every link in the food chain was compromised. The flour was adulterated at the mill. The bread was adulterated at the bakery. The meat pies from the street vendor contained who knew what. The sweets were coloured with lead and arsenic. Even the tea, that comforting constant of working-class life, was often padded with dried leaves from other plants, coloured with various dyes, and sold at prices that still represented a significant portion of a worker's income. This was the world that Victorian food reformers would eventually challenge. Not just the specific practice of adding alum to bread or lead to sweets, but the entire system that made such practices profitable and inevitable. The solution would require more than catching a few bad actors. It would require fundamentally rethinking the relationship between commerce, government, and public health. But before we get to the reformers and their reforms, let's linger a bit longer in this world of adulterated bread and industrial eating. Because there are still details to explore, textures to feel, flavours to taste, even if those flavours might include notes of chalk, alum, and bone ash. Consider a day in the life of a typical working-class family in, say, Manchester in 1855. The father works in a cotton mill, arriving at 6 in the morning and working until 8 at night, with a half-hour break for dinner. The mother works as a domestic servant in a wealthy household across town, leaving before dawn and returning after dark. The two older children, aged 12 and 14, work in the same mill as their father, on different shifts. The younger children, aged 6 and 8, are left largely to their own devices during the day. supervised loosely by a neighbour who has too many responsibilities of her own to provide much attention. Breakfast for this family is bread and tea, consumed hurriedly before the day's work begins. The bread was purchased the previous evening from a bakery 3 streets over, the cheapest option available, which means the most heavily adulterated. The tea is weak, reused from yesterday's leaves, but heavily sweetened with sugar that may or may not be pure cane. The children eat quickly and without ceremony. There's no time for anything else. At midday, the father and older children eat whatever they've brought from home. More bread, perhaps with a scraping of dripping if the budget allows, washed down with more tea from a shared pot kept warm on the mill stove. The mother, working in a wealthy household, might receive a bit of food from the kitchen, servants' portions, less prestigious cuts, but generally more nutritious than what she'd eat at home. The younger children fend for themselves, spending whatever pennies they've been given on whatever strikes their fancy: hot pies, sweets, baked potatoes from street vendors. The evening meal, eaten in shifts as family members return from their various occupations, is the day's most substantial. It might include some meat, cheap cuts stewed or boiled to stretch them as far as possible. More bread, of course. Potatoes when in season and affordable. Perhaps some cabbage or other vegetables, boiled until soft in the same pot as the meat to extract every possible bit of nutrition. Tea, always tea, the universal lubricant of working-class life. This meal is prepared by whoever happens to be home, often the younger children following instructions left by their mother. The cooking facilities are minimal: a single fire, a few pots, no oven. Anything elaborate is out of the question. The goal is to produce something filling and reasonably palatable, not to create culinary art. And every element of this meal, from the breakfast bread to the evening stew, is potentially compromised. The bread contains alum and chalk. The sugar may be adulterated with sand or flour. The meat might be from an animal that died of disease rather than being properly slaughtered. The vegetables were grown in soil fertilized with urban waste, sold by vendors who have no means of storing them properly, and are often half-rotted by the time they reach the family's pot. Even the water used for cooking and tea carries its own risks. Urban water supplies in this era were notoriously contaminated with sewage and industrial waste. This family is not starving, strictly speaking. They're getting enough calories to survive, to work their shifts, to reproduce and raise the next generation of factory workers. But they're being slowly poisoned, slowly depleted, slowly worn down by a food system that treats them as inputs rather than as human beings deserving of nourishment and care. Multiply this family by millions across decades, and you begin to understand the scale of the problem that Victorian reformers would eventually confront. This wasn't a matter of a few bad apples spoiling the bunch. The entire orchard was rotten, from roots to branches, and fixing it would require digging up the whole thing and starting over. The scale of bread adulteration was so vast and so normalized that many people simply accepted it as inevitable. All bread has alum in it, was the common wisdom, stated not as an accusation but as a simple fact of life, like water is wet, or winters are cold. Trying to find unadulterated bread was like trying to find a politician without opinions, theoretically possible, but not something a sensible person would waste time attempting. This normalization of adulteration had interesting psychological effects. People developed a kind of learned helplessness about their food supply. What was the point of worrying about what was in your bread when you couldn't do anything about it anyway? Better to not think about it too much, to eat what was available and to hope for the best. The alternative, constant anxiety about every bite, was simply unsustainable. Some people did try to protect themselves. Home baking, for those who had the time and facilities, was one option. At least you knew what went into your own bread, even if you couldn't be sure about the flour. Some households formed buying clubs, pooling their resources to purchase ingredients in bulk from more reputable sources. A few neighborhood bakeries developed reputations for honesty and charged premium prices accordingly, serving customers who could afford to pay extra for peace of mind. But these individual solutions could never address the systemic problem. As long as adulteration was profitable and unpoliced, it would continue. As long as the market rewarded deception and punished honesty, the honest producers would be driven out of business. The invisible hand of the market, left to its own devices, was slowly strangling the people it was supposed to serve. What was needed was a visible hand, the hand of government, reaching into the marketplace to set rules, enforce standards, and punish violators. But the Victorian state was deeply reluctant to interfere in commerce. The reigning ideology of laissez-faire economics held that markets worked best when left alone, that government intervention inevitably made things worse, that the wisdom of individual buyers and sellers would, over time, sort everything out. This ideology conveniently ignored the massive information asymmetry between producers and consumers. A baker knew exactly what was in his bread. A customer had no way of finding out. A manufacturer knew which toxic pigments coloured his sweets. A child buying them knew only that they were pretty and sweet. In a market where one party has all the information and the other party has none, buyer beware is not a level playing field. It's a license for exploitation. But the ideology persisted, and government intervention in food markets remained minimal through the first half of the 19th century. The ancient laws against adulteration remained on the books but were almost never enforced. Local authorities had neither the expertise nor the resources to test food products systematically, and the political power of food producers, a large and economically significant interest group, made any attempt at regulation politically difficult. This would eventually change, as we'll see in later chapters. The Bradford poisoning of 1858, the publication of systematic analyses of food adulteration, and the growing public outrage would eventually force Parliament to act. But in the 1840s and 50s, the period we're describing now, the system remained essentially unregulated. The bread remained adulterated, the workers remained malnourished, and the profits kept flowing to those who had learned to game the system. Let's end this chapter where we began, with bread, and with the human beings who depended on it. A baker in Birmingham, let's call him Thomas, has been in the trade for 30 years. He learned from his father, who learned from his father, stretching back generations in the craft. Thomas knows bread the way a musician knows their instrument. The feel of the dough, the smell of the fermentation, the exact moment when a loaf is ready to come out of the oven. Thomas also knows adulteration. He's been adding alum to his dough since his apprenticeship. It's simply how bread is made. He buys his flour from a factor who gets it from a mill that he's never visited, and he doesn't ask too many questions about what's in it. He knows his competitors are doing the same things he's doing, and he knows that customers expect the white, light, soft bread that alum helps produce. Is Thomas a villain? He doesn't feel like one. He's a working man, supporting a family, running a business in a competitive market. He's doing what everyone does, what his father did, what he was taught to do. The alum doesn't seem to hurt anyone directly. No one has ever collapsed in his shop after eating his bread. If there are long-term health effects, they're invisible, diffuse, impossible to trace back to any particular loaf or any particular baker. And yet Thomas is part of a system that is slowly poisoning his customers. His bread, consumed day after day by working families who have no alternative, is contributing to their digestive problems, their nutritional deficiencies, their general ill health. The chalk and plaster in his flour are filling their stomachs without nourishing their bodies. The alum is interfering with their digestion, reducing their absorption of what few nutrients they're getting from other sources. Thomas doesn't see himself as a poisoner, but he is one, not through malice, but through participation in a corrupted system. And this is perhaps the most troubling aspect of Victorian food adulteration. It turned ordinary people into unwitting agents of harm, normalised practices that would be recognised as criminal under any reasonable standard, and created a world where poisoning your customers was just the cost of doing business. The workers eating Thomas's bread don't know they're being poisoned either. They know the bread isn't quite what their grandparents ate back in the village. It seems lighter somehow, less sustaining, more likely to leave you hungry an hour after eating. But bread is bread, isn't it? It keeps you going through the shift, fills the hole in your stomach, gives you the energy to keep moving. What more can you ask for at the prices you can afford? And so the wheel keeps turning. Thomas bakes his adulterated bread. The workers eat it and go to their shifts. The factory owners extract their labour and their profits. The whole system churns along, converting human health into economic productivity, treating people as inputs rather than as ends in themselves. But somewhere, in laboratories and lecture halls, in newspaper offices and parliamentary committees, questions are beginning to be asked. What exactly is in this bread? Who is responsible for its purity? What role should government play in protecting consumers from harm? The age of investigation is dawning, and the age of reform is not far behind. For now, though, the baker keeps baking, the workers keep eating, and the adulteration continues. The bread is white and soft and cheap, and if it's slowly killing the people who eat it, well, that's a problem for another day, another generation, another chapter of history. Sleep well, friends, and be grateful for the regulations that stand between you and Victorian baking practices. Your breakfast toast, whatever its faults may be, is almost certainly free of alum, chalk and bone ash. That's not nothing. That's the hard-won legacy of reformers who looked at the world we've been describing and said this cannot stand. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. There's more to explore yet, Milk and meat and 100 other foods, each with its own story of adulteration and eventual reform. The Victorian marketplace has more secrets to reveal, and we're just getting started. But before we move on, let's take one more look at the peculiar economics of portable food, the phenomenon that industrialization created and that would shape eating habits for generations to come. The concept of food you could carry with you, eat without utensils and consume in minutes rather than hours wasn't new exactly. Travellers had always needed portable provisions, and markets had always sold ready-to-eat items. But the industrial era transformed occasional convenience into daily necessity, and in doing so created entirely new categories of food products. Consider the meat pie, that quintessential Victorian street food. Before factories, a meat pie was a homemade affair, baked by housewives using whatever meat was available from the family's own livestock or the local butcher. The crust was thick and sturdy, designed to preserve the contents during storage rather than to be particularly palatable. You ate the filling and often discarded the crust, which had served its purpose as an edible container. The industrial meat pie was a different creature entirely. It was made in quantity by commercial bakers, sold hot from street stalls and shop windows, and designed to be consumed immediately by workers with no time to spare. The crust became thinner and more edible, part of the meal rather than just packaging. The filling became a matter of creative economy, how to produce something that tasted like meat without using too much actual meat. The ingenuity applied to this problem was really quite remarkable in a horrifying sort of way. Meat pie manufacturers discovered that you could stretch a small quantity of actual meat into a much larger quantity of pie filling by adding various extenders. Breadcrumbs were the most innocent, just filler, not harmful, reducing the cost while maintaining bulk. Potatoes served a similar function and added a bit of genuine nutrition. But the truly creative operators went further. Offal, organ meats, tripe and other parts that middle-class consumers rejected, could be minced fine enough to be unrecognizable and mixed with the filling. Gristle and connective tissue, which would be inedible on their own, became acceptable when chopped small and hidden in gravy. Some manufacturers reportedly used meat that was, to put it delicately, no longer at its freshest, the kind of meat that a reputable butcher would discard but that could still, technically, be consumed without immediate ill effect if cooked thoroughly enough. The spices and flavourings added to pie filling served multiple purposes. Yes, they made the food taste better, but they also masked flavours that might otherwise alert the consumer to the questionable quality of the ingredients. A heavily seasoned pie might be delicious precisely because you couldn't quite tell what you were eating, and that ambiguity was often intentional. The economics of street food vending created particular pressures toward adulteration and corner cutting. Street vendors typically operated on the thinnest possible margins, competing with each other for customers who might switch allegiances over a difference of a halfpenny. They bought their stock from suppliers who were themselves under price pressure, creating a chain of cost-cutting that extended from the original ingredients to the final product. A pie seller might purchase their pies from a wholesale baker who bought meat from a factors who sourced it from wherever it was cheapest that day. At each link in this chain, there were incentives to substitute cheaper ingredients, to stretch limited supplies, to make a little go a longer way. By the time the pie reached the customer, it had passed through so many hands that tracing its exact contents would have required a detective. This opacity was both a feature and a bug of the Victorian food system. From the seller's perspective, it provided plausible deniability. They didn't know exactly what was in the pies they sold, so how could they be held responsible? From the customer's perspective, it meant that every purchase was an act of blind faith, a gamble that the food was at least minimally acceptable. The customers, of course, knew this on some level. Working-class Victorians were not naive about the food they ate. They knew that cheap food was cheap for reasons, and they developed their own strategies for navigating the marketplace. Regular customers built relationships with vendors they trusted, or at least vendors whose products hadn't made them sick yet. Word spread quickly about sellers whose products were particularly questionable, and a reputation for poisoning customers was bad for business, at least in neighbourhoods where people talked to each other. But these informal mechanisms of quality control had obvious limitations. A vendor could maintain a decent reputation while still selling adulterated products, as long as the adulteration wasn't severe enough to cause immediate obvious illness. The slow accumulation of lead from coloured sweets, the gradual digestive damage from alum in bread, these weren't the kind of problems that would generate complaints or damage a seller's standing. The harm was real but invisible, dispersed across time and population in ways that no individual customer could track. The emergence of larger-scale food manufacturers in the later Victorian period would, in theory, have provided an opportunity for better quality control. A large factory could maintain consistent standards, source ingredients more carefully, and build a brand reputation that depended on product quality. And indeed, some of the early branded food companies, Cadbury, Rowntree and others, explicitly marketed themselves as providers of pure, unadulterated products, distinguishing themselves from the dodgy street vendors and corner shops. But large-scale production also created new opportunities for large-scale adulteration. A factory producing thousands of products per day could cut costs through systematic adulteration, spreading the savings and the harm across a much larger customer base. The same economies of scale that made manufacturing efficient also made fraud efficient. And the distance between producer and consumer in a mass-market system meant that complaints were less likely to reach the people responsible. The evolution of food retailing during this period also shaped patterns of consumption. The traditional model had been small shops and market stalls, where customers bought directly from vendors they knew personally. But the Victorian era saw the emergence of larger shops and early department stores, offering a wider variety of goods under one roof. These establishments provided convenience and selection, but they also created another layer of separation between the consumer and the source of their food. A customer buying bread from a market stall might know the baker personally, might have some sense of their reputation and practices. A customer buying bread from a large grocery shop knew nothing about where it came from, who made it, or what standards they applied. They were trusting the shop's buyer, who was trusting the wholesaler, who was trusting the manufacturer, in a chain of confidence that could easily be abused at any link. This transformation of food from a local personal transaction to an anonymous industrial commodity is one of the defining characteristics of the Victorian era, and its effects persist to this day. We still buy most of our food from strangers, still trust systems and institutions to ensure quality, still remain largely ignorant of what happens between farm and table. The Victorian reformers who fought for food safety regulation were fighting not just against specific adulterants, but against the dangers inherent in this new system of depersonalized commerce. The fact their grandparents had mostly eaten what they grew, raised, or bought from neighbors. Their grandchildren would eat food shipped from around the world, processed in factories they'd never see, sold by corporations whose only interest was profit. The Victorians lived through the transition, experiencing both the benefits of greater variety and availability and the costs of reduced trust and transparency. What's remarkable looking back is how quickly people adapted to this new reality. Within a generation, the expectation of knowing where your food came from had largely disappeared among urban populations. The ancient relationship between humans and their sustenance, a relationship built on knowledge and trust and seasonal rhythms, had been severed by the industrial knife. This disconnection had psychological as well as physical consequences. When you grow your own food, or buy it from someone who did, you have a relationship with it. You know its story, its provenance, its character. When you buy anonymous products from anonymous sellers, food becomes a mere transaction, an exchange of money for calories with no deeper meaning. The Victorians didn't articulate this loss in quite these terms. They had more immediate concerns like making rent and avoiding cholera. But the sense that something had gone wrong with food, that eating had become somehow degraded and dangerous, permeated the culture of the era. The frequent food scares, the growing demand for reform, the eventual acceptance of government regulation, all of these reflected a society grappling with the consequences of industrialized eating. And at the heart of it all was bread, the staff of life, transformed into a vehicle for alum and chalk and bone ash. The most basic food, the foundation of every meal, the one thing nobody could do without, compromised, adulterated, made into an instrument of slow harm rather than nourishment. If even bread couldn't be trusted, what could? That question would eventually force an answer that would take the form of laws and inspectors and scientific testing. But arriving at that answer took decades of suffering, scandal and struggle. The Victorians who fought for pure food were fighting against powerful interests and entrenched practices, against an ideology that resisted government intervention, against the inertia of a system that had made adulteration profitable and honesty costly. Their eventual victory, partial, imperfect, but real, is a story we'll tell in later chapters. For now, we rest in the darkness of the unregulated marketplace, where bread is stone and sugar is poison, and the price of poverty is measured in health as well as money. The factory bells will ring again tomorrow, calling workers to another day of labour fueled by adulterated food. The bakers will rise before dawn to prepare their alum-laced loaves. The street vendors will set up their carts, selling pies of dubious composition to customers too hungry and hurried to care. The great machine of Victorian commerce will grind on, converting human lives into products and profits. But change is coming, slowly, invisibly, in laboratories and lecture halls and the minds of people who believe things could be better. The age of investigation is about to dawn, and after investigation will come outrage, and after outrage will come action. The long night of adulteration is not yet over, but morning is on the horizon. Rest now, and let these stories settle into your mind like flour settling in a bin. Some of it pure, some of it adulterated, all of it part of the complex mixture that makes up our understanding of the past. Tomorrow we'll continue our journey through the Victorian marketplace, exploring new products and new scandals, new villains and new heroes. For now, the bread is still white, the sweets are still bright, and the truth is still hiding in plain sight. But not for much longer. Now that we've thoroughly ruined bread for you, let's move on to something equally fundamental to the Victorian diet, something that mothers gave to their children with love and trust, something that represented purity and wholesomeness in the popular imagination, something that was, in reality, about as pure as the Thames at low tide. We're talking about milk. Milk in Victorian England occupied a peculiar position in the cultural consciousness. It was associated with all things good and natural, the countryside, healthy children, maternal care, the simple, honest life of rural England that city dwellers increasingly romanticised even as they fled from it. A glass of fresh milk was supposed to be one of nature's perfect foods, a complete nutrition delivered straight from the cow to your table. What could possibly be more wholesome? Well, quite a lot of things, as it turned out. Because the milk that actually reached Victorian consumers, especially urban consumers, especially poor urban consumers, bore about as much resemblance to fresh country milk as a London fog bears to mountain air. The journey from cow to cup was long, complicated, and provided abundant opportunities for the kind of creative modification we've come to expect from Victorian food suppliers. Let's start at the source and work our way forward. The cows that produced milk for urban markets were not, for the most part, the bucolic creatures you might imagine grazing peacefully in green meadows. Many of them lived in urban dairies, cramped, filthy establishments located in the hearts of cities, where land was expensive and space was at a premium. These weren't farms in any meaningful sense. They were milk factories, and the conditions would make a modern health inspector reach for the smelling salts. A typical urban dairy might house dozens of cows in a space barely adequate for a fraction of that number. The animals stood in their own waste, often for days at a time, as proper cleaning was time-consuming and labour was expensive. Ventilation was minimal, windows let in cold air in winter and were therefore kept shut, creating an atmosphere that was, to put it mildly, aromatic. The cows were fed on whatever was cheapest and most readily available, which in urban areas often meant distillery waste, the leftover mash from whiskey and gin production, a substance that was cheap, abundant, and absolutely terrible for bovine health. This distillery slop, as it was called, had some advantages from the dairy operator's perspective. It was essentially free since the distilleries were happy to have someone haul it away. It could be fed to cows in liquid form, reducing labour costs. And it made the cows produce a lot of milk. More milk than they would produce on a normal diet of hay and grass. The disadvantages were, unfortunately, rather significant. Cows fed on distillery waste became sick. Their milk had an off-flavour that required masking. Their lifespans shortened dramatically. A cow that might have produced milk for 10 years on a proper diet would be worn out and ready for the knacker's yard within 2 or 3 years on distillery slop. But from a purely economic standpoint, this was acceptable. Cows were cheap, and the volume of milk produced while they lasted made the investment worthwhile. The milk from these sickly, confined, poorly fed animals was not exactly what you'd call premium quality, even before anyone started tampering with it. It was often thin, with a greyish or bluish tinge that suggested something was not quite right. The flavour could be off, tainted by the distillery waste or by the general unhealthiness of the animals producing it. And of course, it was teeming with bacteria. The germ theory of disease was only beginning to gain acceptance, and the concept of pasteurisation was decades away from widespread implementation. But this was just the starting point. The real transformation of Victorian milk occurred during its journey from dairy to consumer, a journey that could take many hours and pass through many hands, each of which had incentives to modify the product in ways that would not benefit the eventual drinker. The first and most universal form of milk adulteration was simple dilution, Water was free after all, or nearly so. You could get it from a pump, a river or a well with minimal effort. And milk diluted with water looked very much like milk, especially if you'd never seen what proper full cream milk was supposed to look like. A dairy operator who added 10% water to his milk increased his volume by 10% at essentially no cost. The temptation was irresistible, and virtually everyone gave in to it. The problem with watered milk, of course, was that it didn't look quite right. Real milk has a certain richness, a certain opacity, a certain colour that water simply lacks. Diluted milk looked thin, bluish and watery, which of course it was. Customers who knew what proper milk looked like could spot the dilution, and even unsophisticated buyers might be suspicious of product that seemed less substantial than expected. The solution to this problem was additional adulteration to disguise the initial adulteration. It's like the old joke about the patient who went to the doctor complaining about the side effects of medication prescribed for the side effects of medication prescribed for the original complaint. One lie leads to another, each designed to cover up the traces of the last. To restore the appearance of richness to watered milk, dairy operators added chalk. Yes, the same chalk we encountered in the bread chapter, calcium carbonate, ground fine enough to dissolve into the liquid and make it appear whiter and more opaque. A dash of chalk transformed suspicious-looking watered milk into something that at least resembled the genuine article. The fact that you are now drinking what was essentially a very dilute whitewash apparently troubled no one in the supply chain. Some operators preferred other whitening agents. Plaster of Paris made occasional appearances, as did flour, starch, and even white lead. Yes, the same toxic substance used to colour candy. The goal was always the same, to make diluted milk look less diluted, to restore the visual cues of quality, even while the actual quality continued to decline. But whiteness wasn't the only quality that dilution affected. Real milk has a certain sweetness, a certain richness of flavour that comes from its fat and sugar content. Watered milk tasted flat, thin, lifeless. To compensate, some adulterators added sugar, not a terrible choice, health-wise, though it did add cost. Others used cheaper alternatives like molasses, which restored some sweetness but added a flavour that didn't quite belong. The fat content was trickier to fake. Milk fat, cream, is what gives whole milk its richness and body. Once you've diluted the milk, the cream is proportionally reduced, and there's no easy way to restore it. Some operators skimmed the cream off entirely before dilution, selling it separately as a premium product while the remaining milk became even thinner and less nutritious. The milk that reached the poorest consumers might have been diluted and skimmed, a pale ghost of the nutritious fluid it was supposed to be. But the challenges of milk adulteration went beyond simple dilution. There was also the problem of preservation, or rather the complete absence thereof. Victorian England had no refrigeration. None. Zero. The icebox existed for wealthy households, but it required regular deliveries of ice, which was expensive and logistically complicated. For the average, milk was transported in open cans, exposed to whatever temperature the weather provided. In summer, this meant warm milk. And warm milk, as anyone who has accidentally left a carton out overnight can attest, does not stay fresh for very long. The bacterial load in Victorian milk was astronomical by modern standards. Even assuming the source animals were healthy, which as we've discussed they often weren't, milk provides an ideal growth medium for all sorts of microorganisms. In the hours between milking and consumption, bacteria multiplied exponentially. The milk that reached customers was often already turning, developing an off smell and a sour taste that announced its declining condition. The standard response to this problem was not to improve hygiene or speed up delivery, but to chemically disguise the spoilage. Bicarbonate of soda, ordinary baking soda, was the adulterant of choice for this purpose. Add a pinch to souring milk and it neutralizes the lactic acid that causes the sour taste. The milk tastes fresh again, or at least fresher than it did. The bacteria are still there, still multiplying, still potentially dangerous, but the customer can't tell by tasting. This practice was so common that many consumers came to associate the slight chemical tang of bicarbonate with fresh milk. They'd actually complain if their milk didn't have that familiar bite, not realizing that what they were tasting was the cover-up rather than the genuine article. A whole generation grew up drinking doctored milk and thinking it was normal. Bicarbonate wasn't the only preservative in use. Borax, a compound we now associate with laundry detergent and slime-making projects, was a popular choice for extending the apparent freshness of dairy products. Formaldehyde, yes, the same substance used to preserve biological specimens, was occasionally employed by the more adventurous adulterators. Salicylic acid, a precursor to aspirin, served a similar purpose. These substances didn't make the milk safe to drink, they just made unsafe milk harder to detect. The distribution system for milk added further opportunities for contamination and adulteration. Milk in Victorian cities was typically delivered by milkmen, who carried it in large cans through the streets, dispensing it into customers' own containers. The cans were rarely cleaned properly between uses. The measuring equipment was often inaccurate, accidentally or deliberately, and the milkman himself had every incentive to stretch his product. A little water added to each can over the course of a day could represent significant additional profit. Some milkmen operated their own small-scale adulteration businesses, purchasing already watered milk from dairies and then watering it further before sale. By the time it reached the consumer's jug, the liquid might be more water than milk, with chalk for whiteness, sugar for sweetness, and bicarbonate to mask the fact that whatever milk content remained was well on its way to becoming yogurt. The customers for this product were predictably concentrated among the poor. Wealthier households could afford to purchase from more reputable dairies, to have milk delivered early in the morning when it was freshest, to maintain ice boxes that slowed spoilage. They could also afford to simply discard milk that seemed off, rather than drinking it anyway because wasting food was an unaffordable luxury. Working-class families had no such options. They bought what they could afford from vendors who operated on the thinnest margins and therefore had the strongest incentives to adulterate. They bought late in the day when prices dropped but quality had deteriorated further. They stretched every drop using milk until it was clearly, unmistakably spoiled, because throwing away food, even food that was making them sick, felt like throwing away money. The health consequences of this contaminated milk supply were severe and fell disproportionately on children. Infants who were fed on diluted, bacteria-laden milk instead of breast milk had dramatically higher mortality rates. The summer months, when warmth accelerated spoilage, were particularly deadly. Infant death rates spiked annually during the hottest weeks, a phenomenon that physicians gradually connected to the milk supply, but could do little to address. Children who survived infancy continued to be affected by the poor quality of available milk. The dilution meant they received less nutrition per glass than they should have. The bacterial contamination caused recurring bouts of illness that sapped their energy and impaired their development. The various chemical adulterants accumulated in their bodies with unknown long-term effects. A child raised on Victorian working-class milk was, almost by definition, a child raised on an inadequate diet. The scale of milk adulteration was staggering. Various investigations conducted throughout the mid-19th century found that the majority of milk sold in English cities was adulterated in some way. Some studies suggested that adulteration rates approached 90% or higher in working-class neighbourhoods. The trade in watered milk was so extensive, so normalised, so thoroughly integrated into the dairy industry that honest milk had become virtually impossible to find at affordable prices. This created a peculiar market dynamic where consumers who knew they were being cheated, and most of them probably suspected as much, continued to buy anyway because there were no alternatives. What else could they do? Growing your own cow was not an option in a London tenement. Going without milk meant depriving your children of what little nutrition the adulterated products still provided. The market for honest milk existed in theory, but in practice the information asymmetry was so severe and the price competition so fierce that adulteration had driven out quality almost entirely. Now let's turn to a related product, one that took all the problems of Victorian milk and somehow made them worse. We're talking ice cream in the Victorian era was not the industrially produced, quality-controlled product we know today. There were no ice cream factories churning out millions of gallons under standardized conditions. Instead, ice cream was produced by small operators, often Italian immigrants who had brought the tradition of frozen desserts from their homeland, working in cramped kitchens with minimal equipment and even less oversight. The basic process of making ice cream hasn't changed much over the centuries. You combine milk, cream, sugar and flavourings, then freeze the mixture while stirring to incorporate air and prevent ice crystals from forming. Simple in theory, but the execution in Victorian England left considerable room for creativity, and not the good kind. Let's start with the milk and cream. As we've just established, these ingredients were already heavily adulterated before they reached the ice cream maker. Whatever dilution, chalking and chemical preservation had been applied to the liquid milk carried over into the frozen product. Ice cream made from watered, doctored milk was watered, doctored ice cream, just colder. But the ice cream makers had their own incentives to stretch their ingredients further. Cream was expensive, the most valuable component of milk, and using it generously ate into profit margins. So they economized. Some ice cream contained minimal cream, relying on milk and added fats to provide richness. Others substituted different fats entirely, and here's where things get particularly unappetizing. Beef fat, also known as tallow, was a popular cream substitute in cheap ice cream. It was cheap, abundant, and when properly processed could provide a richness that mimicked cream. The flavor was different, of course, but flavorings and sugar could mask the difference. A child licking a penny ice cream on a summer afternoon was quite likely consuming frozen beef fat, and they would never know the difference. Lard pig fat served similar purposes. So did various industrial oils and fats whose precise origins were often obscure. The goal was always the same: to produce something that looked and tasted enough like ice cream to satisfy customers while using the cheapest possible ingredients. The concept of ice cream became increasingly flexible, encompassing any frozen sweet substance that could be sold as such. The sugar in ice cream was subject to the same adulterations we've discussed elsewhere, extended with cheaper sweeteners, sometimes contaminated with various impurities. The flavorings were often artificial, derived from chemical sources rather than actual vanilla beans or fruits. A strawberry ice cream might contain no strawberries whatsoever, just chemical compounds that triggered the appropriate taste receptors. But perhaps the most concerning element of Victorian ice cream was the ice itself. Ice, in an era before mechanical refrigeration, was a precious commodity. It had to be harvested in winter, stored in insulated ice houses, and distributed throughout the year as supplies lasted. For wealthy households, this meant clean ice cut from frozen ponds and lakes in rural areas, transported at considerable expense to urban markets. For cheap ice cream vendors, it meant whatever ice was available at prices they could afford. And the cheapest ice came from the most convenient sources, which in London meant the Thames, the canals, and various urban waterways that also served as sewers, industrial waste dumps, and general repositories for everything the city wanted to dispose of. The ice harvested from these sources was, to put it scientifically, absolutely disgusting. It contained bacteria from human and animal waste. It contained industrial chemicals from the factories that lined the riverbanks. It contained sediment, debris, and substances that defied easy identification. When this ice melted into the ice cream mixture, as it inevitably did during the churning process, it contributed its full complement of contaminants to the final product. Some ice cream makers were aware of these problems and tried to minimize them by using the contaminated ice only for cooling rather than incorporating it directly into the mixture. But in practice, this distinction was difficult to maintain. The ice surrounded the mixing container, slowly melting, dripping, finding its way into the product it was supposed to be cooling. Perfect separation was essentially impossible under the conditions that prevailed in most operations. The equipment used to make and serve ice cream added its own hazards. The mixing containers were often copper or brass, metals that could leach into acidic mixtures. The paddles used for stirring were rarely cleaned thoroughly between batches. The storage containers accumulated residues that harboured bacteria and contributed off flavours to subsequent productions. And then there were the penny licks, those small glass dishes we mentioned earlier, used by street vendors to serve individual portions of ice cream. A customer would receive a glass filled with ice cream, lick it clean, and return the glass to the vendor, who would refill it for the next customer. No washing occurred between customers. The same glass might serve dozens of people in a single day, each of them leaving behind whatever bacteria they happened to be carrying. This was essentially a disease transmission system disguised as a dessert service. Tuberculosis, typhoid, scarlet fever, and various other communicable diseases could spread easily through shared, unwashed serving vessels. The penny lick was a public health disaster waiting to happen, and indeed it did happen, repeatedly, though the connections between ice cream consumption and disease outbreaks were often difficult to trace in an era before systematic epidemiology. The vendors themselves were not for the most part villains. They were typically poor immigrants trying to make a living in a difficult environment. Italian families, in particular, dominated the ice cream trade in Victorian London, bringing traditional recipes and techniques from their homeland, but adapting them to local conditions and budget constraints. The economics of street ice cream vending were brutal. A vendor might spend all day pushing a cart through crowded streets, selling penny portions to children and workers, and end up with barely enough profit to cover the cost of ingredients for the next day's production. Any price increase would drive customers to competitors. Any quality improvement would eat into margins that were already razor thin. The pressure to adulterate, to economize, to cut corners was intense and constant. The customers, meanwhile, had limited options for evaluating what they were buying. Ice cream was cold and sweet and refreshing. What more was there to know? The concept of food safety was barely developed, and the idea that something so delightful could be dangerous probably didn't occur to most consumers. They paid their penny, they enjoyed their treat, and they didn't think too hard about where it came from or what it contained. Children were the primary consumers of street ice cream, which made the health hazards particularly concerning. A child's immune system is less developed than an adult's, making them more vulnerable to the bacterial contamination that was endemic in the product. And children are also more sensitive to the effects of toxic substances, meaning that the lead from coloured decorations or the chemicals from preserved milk would affect them more severely. The summer months brought peak demand for ice cream and peak danger from consuming it. Heat accelerated bacterial growth in the product. It melted the ice more quickly, increasing the incorporation of contaminated water. It made storage and transport more difficult, meaning that ice cream reaching customers was often partially melted and refrozen, with each cycle allowing additional bacterial multiplication. Outbreaks of illness following ice cream consumption were regularly reported in Victorian newspapers, though they were rarely connected to systematic problems with the trade. A cluster of sick children in a particular neighbourhood might be attributed to summer complaint, or cholera infantum, catch-all terms for gastrointestinal illnesses that spiked in warm weather. The specific role of contaminated ice cream was suspected but difficult to prove. Some vendors were worse than others, of course. The most egregious operators used milk that was actively spoiled, ice that was visibly dirty, and equipment that hadn't been cleaned since purchase. Others made genuine efforts to maintain standards, using the best ingredients they could afford and keeping their equipment as clean as circumstances allowed. But even the best-intentioned vendor was working within a system that made safe ice cream almost impossible to produce and sell at prices that working-class customers could afford. The regulatory vacuum that enabled these practices was by now familiar. There were no inspectors checking ice cream production. There were no standards for ingredients or hygiene. There were no requirements for vendor licensing or training. Anyone could set up an ice cream operation, and many did, with varying levels of competence and conscientiousness. The transformation from this wild west of frozen treats to the regulated industry we know today would take decades and multiple public health crises. The penny lick would eventually be banned, replaced by the edible cone, an innovation that solved the shared vessel problem by creating a container that the customer consumed along with the contents. Pasteurization of milk would dramatically reduce bacterial contamination. Mechanical refrigeration would eliminate the need for contaminated river ice. Quality standards and inspections would drive the worst operators out of business. But all of that was in the future. In the 1850s and 60s, ice cream remained a delightful, dangerous, thoroughly unregulated product, sold on street corners to children who had no idea what they were consuming. The happiness it provided was real, so were the risks. And the people who profited from it, from the dairy farmers feeding distillery waste to their cows, to the ice harvesters scraping frozen sewage off the Thames, to the vendors pushing their carts through crowded streets, were all caught up in a system that rewarded corner cutting and punished quality. This was the Victorian food economy in microcosm, a chain of compromises, each one seemingly small and individually forgivable, that together produced a product capable of killing the children who consumed it. No single person in the chain was a murderer. No single decision was obviously evil, but the cumulative effect was a slow-motion public health catastrophe, paid for primarily by the poor who had no other options. The milk that went into the ice cream was watered and chalked. The fat that enriched it came from beef and pigs rather than cream. The sugar that sweetened it was adulterated with who knows what. And the glass that served it passed from mouth to mouth, carrying diseases along with frozen dessert. It's enough to make you appreciate the industrial food system we have today, with all its flaws. At least when you buy ice cream from a modern supermarket, you can be reasonably confident that it's made from actual dairy products, frozen with clean ice, and served in containers that haven't touched anyone else's mouth. That confidence is the product of the struggles we'll explore in later chapters. The scientists who documented adulteration, the journalists who publicized it, the reformers who fought for change, and the legislators who eventually acted. But we're not there yet. We're still in the era of penny licks and river ice, of chalk milk and beef fat ice cream, of summer pleasures that carried hidden dangers. Some knowledge is too heavy for a summer afternoon. Let's leave them there for now, enjoying their treats in ignorance, while we prepare to explore yet another corner of the Victorian marketplace. There are more secrets to uncover, more adulterations to document, more uncomfortable truths about our ancestors' diet. The meat pies await, with their mysteries of filling and composition. The beer beckons with its chemical enhancements and dubious ingredients. The tea calls out with its colourful additives and exotic extensions. The Victorian marketplace is vast, and we've only scratched the surface. Every product has its story, every vendor has their techniques, every consumer has their compromises. The system that produced all this adulteration was not created by evil people. It was created by ordinary people, operating under extraordinary pressure, in an environment with no rules and no oversight. Understanding how that system worked, and how it was eventually reformed, is essential for understanding our own food system and its vulnerabilities. The impulse to cut corners, to stretch ingredients, to prioritize profit over safety, these are not uniquely Victorian traits. They exist wherever markets operate without adequate oversight, wherever the information asymmetry between producers and consumers is severe, wherever the costs of honesty outweigh the costs of deception. The Victorians learned these lessons the hard way, through sickness and death and scandal. Their experience led to the creation of regulatory systems that protect us to this day. But those systems require constant maintenance and updating, constant vigilance against new forms of adulteration and new opportunities for fraud. The fight for food safety didn't end with the Victorian era. It's an ongoing struggle that each generation must take up anew. For now, though, let's pause and appreciate how far we've come. The milk in your refrigerator has been pasteurized and tested. The ice cream in your freezer was made under sanitary conditions with regulated ingredients. The bread on your counter contains what its label says it contains, or at least what the regulations require it to contain. These are not small achievements. They're the product of centuries of struggle, of lives lost and lessons learned, of a gradual awakening to the need for collective action to solve collective problems. The Victorian children licking their penny ices didn't know how dangerous their treats might be, but their suffering, and the suffering of millions like them, eventually forced a reckoning. Out of that reckoning came the food safety systems we rely on today. Imperfect, certainly, but incomparably better than what came before. That's the arc of this story, the journey we're tracing together, from ignorance to knowledge, from exploitation to protection, from caveat emptor to regulated markets. It's not a simple story, and it doesn't have simple heroes or villains. But it's a story worth knowing, because it reminds us that the things we take for granted, safe milk, clean ice cream, bread that's actually bread, were hard-won and could be lost again if we stop paying attention. The market stalls are closing for the evening now, the vendors packing up their wares, the last customers hurrying home with their purchases. Tomorrow it will begin again, the selling, the buying, the adulterating, the consuming. The great wheel of Victorian commerce turns without ceasing, grinding out profits and problems in equal measure. But somewhere in a laboratory or a lecture hall someone is asking questions. What's really in this milk? Why do so many children get sick in summer? How can we know what we're eating? These questions, once asked, will not go away. They'll grow louder and more insistent until finally, eventually, something will be done. That moment is coming. But first, there's more of the marketplace to explore, more products to examine, more secrets to uncover. The milk and ice cream have given up their mysteries, but there's so much more to find in the Victorian kitchen of horrors. But before we move on entirely, let's spend a bit more time with the dairy trade, because there are aspects of it we haven't fully explored, aspects that reveal even more about the Victorian relationship with food, commerce, and trust. Consider the position of the urban dairy farmer, if we can even call them that. They were urban industrialists who happened to work with cows instead of looms or furnaces. Their operations were designed for maximum output at minimum cost, and the welfare of the animals was, at best, a secondary consideration. The conditions in urban dairies were regularly condemned by observers who bothered to visit them. The stench alone was enough to drive away anyone with a functioning nose. The accumulated waste of dozens of cows, rarely removed, fermenting in the heat of close confinement. The animals themselves were often visibly sick, their coats matted and dull, their eyes rheumy, their bodies wasted from the inadequate diet of distillery slop that was their primary sustenance. These cows were, in essence, being worked to death for their milk. A healthy cow on a proper diet might produce milk for a decade or more. The urban dairy cow, fed on industrial waste and confined in conditions that promoted disease, might last 2 or 3 years before becoming too sick or exhausted to continue. At that point, she would be sold for whatever her carcass was worth, usually to the manufacturers of cheap meat products, where her diseased flesh would find its way into the pies and sausages of working-class consumers. This cycle of exploitation affected the milk in ways beyond simple bacterial contamination. Sick cows produce different milk than healthy cows. The composition changes, the fat content drops, the flavour deteriorates. Even before any deliberate adulteration, the milk from urban dairies was a compromised product, the fluid output of animals that were being systematically abused. Some urban dairies were worse than others, of course. The very worst were genuine horrors. Basement operations where cows never saw sunlight, where the accumulated filth reached depths measured in feet rather than inches, where the animals stood in conditions that would have gotten a modern operator imprisoned for animal cruelty. But even the good urban dairies, the ones operated by conscientious owners who tried to maintain some standards, were constrained by the economics and logistics of keeping cattle in cities. The alternative, sourcing milk from rural dairies and transporting it to urban markets, presented its own challenges. The distances involved were significant, and without refrigeration, milk spoiled rapidly during transport. A load of milk that left a farm fresh in the morning might be turning by the time it reached London in the afternoon. The logistics of the Victorian dairy trade essentially guaranteed that urban consumers would receive inferior product. Some entrepreneurs tried to solve this problem through various preservation methods. Condensed milk, developed in the 1850s, offered one solution. By removing much of the water and adding sugar, milk could be preserved for extended periods without refrigeration. This was a genuine innovation that would eventually transform the dairy industry. But in its early years, condensed milk was expensive and unfamiliar, not yet a practical solution for working-class consumers. Other preservation attempts were less successful and considerably more dangerous. We've already discussed the use of chemical preservatives like bicarbonate and borax. Some operators experimented with more exotic substances. Formaldehyde was used in some cases, a choice that prioritized preservation over any consideration of consumer health. These chemically preserved milks might last longer, but they carried their own risks that were poorly understood at the time. The transportation infrastructure itself contributed to the problem. Milk was typically moved in open containers, exposed to whatever the environment provided. Dust, dirt, insects, and the effluvia of the urban streets. By the time milk reached the consumer, it had been handled multiple times, exposed to multiple contamination sources, and was well on its way to becoming a bacterial culture medium. The economics of the milk trade created a particularly pernicious race to the bottom. Since consumers couldn't easily distinguish between good milk and bad milk, especially after adulteration had disguised the visible signs of poor quality, there was no market premium for honest dealing. A dairy that invested in better conditions, healthier animals, and cleaner handling would produce a better product, but they couldn't charge more for it because consumers couldn't verify the difference. Meanwhile, their competitors who cut every corner could sell at lower prices and capture market share. This dynamic meant that honest dairy operators were actively punished for their honesty. The market selected for deception, driving out those who refused to participate. Over time, the general quality of available milk declined as the conscientious operators either adopted adulteration practices or went out of business. It was a textbook case of adverse selection, playing out in the most fundamental of food products. The consumers most affected by this dynamic were, as always, the poor. Wealthier households had options that working-class families lacked. They could afford to pay premium prices to reputable suppliers. They could maintain relationships with specific dairies whose practices they trusted. They could afford to discard milk that seemed off, rather than drinking it anyway because waste was unaffordable. And they could supplement their diets with other sources of nutrition, reducing their dependence on any single food product. Working-class families had none of these buffers. They bought from whoever was cheapest, which meant whoever adulterated most aggressively. They couldn't afford to waste anything, so they consumed milk that wealthier people would have rejected. And their diets were so constrained that milk, despite its problems, remained one of their few sources of protein and fat. Giving up milk wasn't really an option. They just had to hope that what they were drinking wouldn't make them too sick. The health consequences fell hardest on children and infants. Breast milk was the safest option for feeding babies, but many mothers couldn't breastfeed, some for medical reasons, others because the demands of work made it impossible. These babies were fed on cow's milk, or milk-based pap, or various other substitutes that exposed them to all the hazards of the adulterated dairy supply. Infant mortality rates in Victorian England were staggeringly high by modern standards, and contaminated milk was a significant contributor. Babies fed on bacteria-laden milk developed diarrheal diseases that their small bodies couldn't withstand. The summer months were particularly deadly, as warmth accelerated spoilage and bacterial growth. The annual spike in infant deaths during hot weather was so regular and so pronounced that it had its own name, summer diarrhea, or cholera infantum. Physicians recognized the connection between milk quality and infant health, but their ability to intervene was limited. But boiling required fuel, which cost money and time, which working mothers didn't have. It also altered the taste and texture of milk in ways that babies sometimes rejected. The gap between medical advice and practical implementation was vast. Some reform-minded individuals attempted to address the problem through charitable efforts. Milk depots were established in some cities, providing clean, safe milk to poor families at subsidized prices. These operations sourced milk from carefully selected rural dairies, implemented strict handling protocols, and sometimes pasteurized or sterilized the product before distribution. They represented a genuine attempt to break the cycle of adulteration and contamination that characterized the commercial milk trade. But these charitable efforts could only reach a fraction of those who needed help. The scale of the problem was simply too vast for private philanthropy to address. What was needed was systematic reform of the entire dairy industry, new regulations, new standards, new enforcement mechanisms that would raise the floor for all milk, rather than providing islands of quality in a sea of contamination. That reform would eventually come, driven by the same forces that would transform other sectors of the food industry. Scientific investigation would document the extent and nature of adulteration. Public outrage would create political pressure for action, and eventually, reluctantly, Parliament would act to regulate an industry that had proven incapable of regulating itself. But the path from recognition of the problem to effective solution was long and winding. Vested interests resisted change at every step. The ideology of laissez-faire economics provided intellectual cover for inaction, and the sheer complexity of the dairy supply chain made regulation genuinely difficult to implement and enforce. We'll trace that path in later chapters, following the reformers and scientists who gradually built the case for intervention, and the legislators who eventually responded. For now, though, let's leave the dairy trade in its unreformed state, a system optimized for profit rather than health, serving products that ranged from merely substandard to actively dangerous, and bearing down most heavily on those least able to protect themselves. The ice cream vendors are packing up their carts as evening approaches, the last of the day's product melting in the summer heat. Tomorrow they'll be back, selling frozen treats to children who have no idea what they're consuming. The milk wagons are making their rounds, delivering their diluted, doctored cargo to households across the city. The system grinds on, as systems do, converting inputs into outputs without regard for the human cost. The profits flow upward, to the dairy owners and the wholesalers and the retailers. The harm flows downward, to the consumers who have no choice but to buy what's available at prices they can afford. And somewhere between the two, the truth gets lost, diluted, doctored, disguised until it's barely recognizable. But truth has a way of surfacing eventually. The questions are being asked, the investigations are beginning, the reckoning is approaching. The age of unregulated dairy is drawing to a close, though the people living through it can't know that yet. They just know that milk tastes different than it should, that their children get sick more often than seems right, that something in the system isn't working the way it's supposed to. That intuition will eventually crystallize into knowledge, and knowledge into action. But for now, the milk is still flowing, the ice cream is still selling, and the Victorian public is still consuming products that no modern regulatory agency would allow anywhere near a store shelf. Let that thought carry you forward as we continue our exploration. There's more to see, more to learn, more uncomfortable truths to confront. The dairy industry was just one corner of the vast Victorian marketplace of adulteration. The meat trade awaits, with its own collection of horrors. The beverage industry beckons, with beer and tea and coffee all subject to their own forms of creative modification. And behind it all, the larger questions loom. How did it get this bad? Who was responsible? And what ultimately was done about it? Those questions will find their answers in the chapters to come. For now, we've spent enough time with milk and ice cream. Their stories are told, their secrets revealed. The next course of our Victorian menu awaits, and I promise you, it's just as appetizing as what we've already sampled. And now we arrive at perhaps the most unsettling corner of the Victorian marketplace, the meat counter. If you've been following along and thinking that surely the British wouldn't adulterate actual meat, that there must be some line they wouldn't cross, some sacred boundary between acceptable fraud and genuine horror, well, I admire your optimism, but I'm afraid I have some news for you. The Victorian meat trade was a masterpiece of creative deception, a triumph of making something out of nearly nothing, and the sausage was its crowning achievement. That humble tube of ground meat, or what was sold as ground meat, represented everything that was wrong with the Victorian food system, compressed into a convenient, affordable package that working families consumed by the millions. Let's start with a fundamental question. What is a sausage? In theory, it's ground meat mixed with fat, seasoned with spices, and stuffed into a casing. Simple enough. But the Victorian sausage maker looked at this recipe and saw infinite opportunities for improvement. Improvement of profit margins, that is, not improvement of the actual product. The first and most obvious economy was in the meat itself. Good meat was expensive. Working-class customers couldn't afford good meat. But they still wanted sausages, which meant there was a market for cheap sausages, which meant there was a market for sausages made from, let's call it economy meat. What constituted economy meat? The polite answer would be less desirable cuts, the trimmings, the scraps, the bits left over after the prime portions had been sold to wealthier customers. This is actually how sausage making began historically, as a way to use every part of the animal rather than wasting anything. And if Victorian sausages had contained only honest trimmings from healthy animals, we wouldn't have much of a story to tell. But the Victorian sausage maker faced pressure to go further. Meat scraps cost money too, after all, and there were cheaper options available if one was willing to be flexible about definitions. Offal, the internal organs of animals, was one such option. Hearts, livers, kidneys, and other organs could be ground fine enough to be undetectable in a sausage mixture. These weren't necessarily unhealthy. Organ meats are actually quite nutritious. But they weren't what customers thought they were buying when they purchased a pork or beef sausage, and the practice represented a form of fraud even if it wasn't directly harmful. Less appetizing was the use of what the trade delicately called lights, the lungs of slaughtered animals. Lungs are spongy, airy organs that don't provide much nutrition but do provide bulk. Ground into a sausage mixture, they helped stretch more valuable ingredients while adding weight that customers would pay for. The texture wasn't quite right, but heavy seasoning could disguise a multitude of sins. Then there were the truly questionable additions. Gristle and connective tissue, too tough to eat on their own, became acceptable when chopped fine and hidden in the general mass. Skin and sinew met similar fates. The parts of the animal that would normally be discarded or sold to the glue factory found their way into sausage casings instead, converted from waste into profit through the magic of the grinder. Some manufacturers went even further, incorporating materials that had never been part of any animal at all. Sawdust was a persistent rumour in the Victorian sausage trade. Finely ground wood pulp that added bulk and absorbed fat, helping to stretch meat supplies while maintaining the expected texture. Whether sawdust was actually used as extensively as the rumour suggested is difficult to verify, but the fact that the rumour was so widespread and so persistent tells us something about what people believed the trade was capable of. Bread and flour were definitely used, and quite openly. A certain amount of cereal filler in sausages was considered acceptable, even normal. It helped bind the mixture, and provided a different texture that some consumers actually preferred. But the proportions could vary wildly. A sausage that was supposed to be mostly meat might end up being mostly bread, with just enough meat flavouring to maintain the pretense. Potatoes served a similar function, especially when they were cheap and plentiful. Boiled, mashed and mixed into the sausage filling, they added bulk and helped hold the mixture together. Again, not harmful in themselves, but certainly not what the customer was paying for when they bought a meat sausage. The fat content of sausages was another area for creative manipulation. Some fat is essential to a good sausage. It provides moisture, flavour and richness. But the fat used in cheap Victorian sausages wasn't always the wholesome pork or beef fat that would have been ideal. Rendered fats of dubious origin, including industrial tallows meant for soap making rather than cooking, sometimes found their way into the mixture. These fats could be rancid, contaminated or simply unpleasant, but heavy seasoning helped mask the off flavours. Speaking of seasoning, the spices in Victorian sausages served purposes beyond simple flavouring. Strong spices like pepper, sage and mace could disguise the taste of substandard meat. They could cover the flavour of incipient spoilage. They could make something that was barely edible seem almost appealing. The more heavily seasoned a sausage, the more suspicious a discerning customer might be about what the seasoning was hiding. The casings that held all this together were traditionally made from animal intestines, a practice that continues to this day in quality sausage making. But cleaning and preparing intestines was labour-intensive and cheaper alternatives existed. Some manufacturers used casings of uncertain provenance, while others experimented with artificial materials that were not necessarily safe for human consumption. The colour of sausages was another area for manipulation. Fresh meat has a particular pink or red colour that consumers associate with quality and freshness. The solution naturally was to add colour back artificially. The colourants used in Victorian sausages were similar to those we've encountered in other products. Red lead could give a nice pink tinge. Vermilion provided colour at the cost of mercury exposure. Various vegetable dyes were also used, some relatively harmless and others less so. The goal was always the same, to make the product look more appealing than its actual composition warranted. Let's pause here and imagine the complete picture of a cheap Victorian sausage. It contains some actual meat, probably from the least desirable parts of the animal. It contains offal, organs that might be nutritious but weren't disclosed. It contains gristle, sinew, and connective tissue, ground fine enough to be undetectable. It might contain sawdust or other non-meat fillers. It definitely contains bread or flour or potatoes. The fat might be rancid or industrial. The colour is artificial, and the heavy seasoning exists largely to disguise all of the above. This is what millions of working-class families were eating, multiple times per week, believing they were getting affordable meat when they were getting a carefully constructed illusion of meat. The sausage wasn't poisonous in the acute sense. It wasn't going to kill you immediately like a dose of arsenic. But it wasn't nutritious either. It was empty calories dressed up as protein, a fraud that extracted money from people who couldn't afford to be defrauded while giving them little of value in return. The meat pie was the sausage's close cousin in the hierarchy of Victorian meat products, and it faced all the same pressures toward adulteration. A pie, after all, is just a sausage's filling wrapped in pastry instead of a casing, and the pastry provides even more opportunity to disguise the contents within. We've touched on meat pies before in our discussion of street food and factory lunches, but they deserve more detailed examination. They were portable, filling, and affordable, everything a factory worker needed for a quick meal between shifts. But what were they filled with? That was the question that probably shouldn't be asked if you wanted to continue enjoying your dinner. The filling of a cheap meat pie was in many ways even more mysterious than the contents of a sausage. At least with a sausage you could see the general texture and colour of the contents. A pie hid its secrets beneath a crust, revealing nothing until you bit into it, and by then you'd already paid and probably already consumed half of it. The best pie makers used actual cuts of meat, properly prepared and honestly represented. But these were not the pies that working-class consumers could afford. The cheap pies, the penny pies sold at factory gates and market stalls, contained whatever the maker could source at the lowest possible price. Meat from animals that had died of disease was one such source. A cow that died of illness couldn't legally be sold for human consumption through normal channels, but it could often find its way to less scrupulous pie makers who weren't asking too many questions. The same was true of horses, dogs, and cats. Animals that weren't considered food in British culture, but whose flesh was difficult to distinguish from beef or pork once it had been chopped, seasoned, and baked into a pie. The rumours about cat and dog meat in Victorian pies were persistent and probably not entirely unfounded. Stray animals were abundant in Victorian cities, and someone willing to collect and butcher them could turn a profit selling the meat to pie makers who didn't inquire too closely about sources. Whether this was common practice or rare scandal is impossible to say with certainty. But the fact that the possibility was so widely discussed suggests that trust in the pie trade was not exactly robust. Horse meat was almost certainly more common, though it too was considered taboo by British consumers. Horses that were too old or sick to work were regularly slaughtered and their meat sold, supposedly for pet food or other non-human purposes, but with plenty of opportunity for diversion into the human food supply. A pie maker purchasing beef from a suspiciously cheap source might not ask too many questions about its actual origin. The vegetable content of meat pies provided another area for stretching. A little onion and potato in a meat pie is perfectly traditional and often desirable, but the proportions could be adjusted dramatically depending on the relative prices of meat and vegetables. A pie that was supposed to be primarily meat might end up being primarily potato, with just enough meat flavouring to justify the name. The gravy that filled the spaces between meat and pastry was itself a work of creative economy. Good gravy requires meat drippings, stock, and careful preparation. Cheap gravy could be made from almost anything. Flour and water thickened with gelatin, coloured brown with burnt sugar or other additives, seasoned heavily to provide flavour that the base ingredients lacked. The gravy in a cheap meat pie might contain almost no actual meat products at all. The pastry crust was perhaps the most honest part of the operation, being difficult to adulterate significantly without affecting the texture. But even here, the flour used might be the same adulterated flour we discussed in the bread chapter, full of alum and chalk and other unwanted additions. And the fat used for shortening might be the same questionable industrial tallow that found its way into sausages. The conditions under which these pies were made added another layer of concern. Small pie-making operations worked in cramped, unsanitary conditions similar to those we've seen in other Victorian food trades. The same hands that handled raw meat handled money and doorknobs and heaven knows what else. Rats had access to ingredients and finished products alike. The concept of food safety as we understand it simply didn't exist. And yet people ate these pies by the millions because they were cheap and filling and tasted reasonably good if you didn't think too hard about what you were eating. The heavy seasoning, the rich gravy, the satisfying crust, all of it combined to create a product that met the immediate needs of hungry workers, even if it failed to meet any reasonable standard of honesty or nutrition. The economics of the meat trade, like those of other Victorian food sectors, created a race to the bottom that honest operators couldn't win. A pie maker who used real meat in reasonable quantities had to charge more than one who stretched meat with fillers and used questionable ingredients. Customers who couldn't taste the difference, or couldn't afford to care, would buy the cheaper product. Over time, the honest operators were driven out or forced to compromise until the entire market was dominated by adulterated products. This brings us to an interesting question. Did people know they were being cheated? The answer is complicated. On some level, everyone understood that cheap food was cheap for reasons. The phrase, "you get what you pay for," isn't a modern invention. The Victorians had their own versions of this wisdom. A working man buying a penny pie at a street stall probably harboured few illusions about the quality of what he was eating. But there's a difference between vague suspicion and specific knowledge. People might suspect that their sausages contained fillers without knowing exactly what those fillers were. They might worry about the meat in their pies without wanting to investigate too closely. There's a certain psychological defense in not knowing the details, in maintaining a comfortable ignorance that allows you to keep eating what you have to eat anyway. The alternative, after all, was not eating, and that wasn't really an option. You can't boycott food when you're hungry and have limited resources. Working-class Victorians were trapped in a system that forced them to consume products they probably suspected were adulterated, because the only alternative was going without. This is the particular cruelty of food adulteration as a form of fraud. It targets people who have no power to protect themselves and no alternatives to turn to. Now let's turn to the consequences of all this. Not the obvious immediate consequences like food poisoning and nutritional deficiency, but the second-order effects that rippled through Victorian society in ways that might not be immediately apparent. One of the most fascinating of these effects was the booming market for medicines, particularly digestive remedies. Victorian England was absolutely awash in pills, powders and potions promising to cure every conceivable ailment of the stomach and bowels. Pharmacies devoted entire walls to digestive remedies. Travelling salesmen made fortunes peddling cure-alls to eager customers. Why was Victorian England so obsessed with digestion? The obvious answer is that everyone was sick. And why was everyone sick? In large part because the food supply was systematically compromised by adulteration that caused exactly the kind of chronic digestive problems that these remedies promised to treat. Consider the cycle that was operating here. People ate bread adulterated with alum, which caused constipation and digestive irritation. They drank milk preserved with bicarbonate and borax, which disrupted their gut chemistry. They consumed sweets coloured with lead, which accumulated in their bodies and caused systemic damage. They ate sausages and pies filled with questionable ingredients that their digestive systems struggled to process. And then, feeling terrible, they sought relief in medicines that promised to solve their problems. The medicine trade was happy to oblige. In fact, it was more than happy. It was absolutely delighted to have such a reliable stream of customers. The same lack of regulation that allowed food adulteration also allowed the manufacture and sale of medicines that were often useless, sometimes harmful, and occasionally deadly. Let's look at some of the popular remedies of the era and what they actually contained. Digestive powders were among the most common products, promising to settle upset stomachs and relieve indigestion. These typically contained bicarbonate of soda, the same substance that was being used to disguise spoiled milk, along with various other ingredients depending on the manufacturer. Some included chalk, which was thought to neutralize stomach acid. Others contained magnesia, which had a mild laxative effect. A few included substances that had no medicinal value whatsoever but sounded impressive on the label. The effectiveness of these powders was variable. Bicarbonate genuinely does neutralize stomach acid, providing temporary relief from heartburn and indigestion. But it doesn't. Laxatives were another hugely popular category. which makes sense given how common constipation was in a population eating alum-laden bread. These range from relatively gentle herbal preparations to violent purgatives that could cause serious harm if used improperly. At the gentle end were products based on senna, rhubarb, or other plant-derived laxatives that had been used for centuries. These worked by irritating the intestinal lining, stimulating contractions that moved contents along. They were effective but could cause cramping, and overuse led to dependency as the bowel became unable to function without stimulation. More concerning were the mineral-based purgatives, particularly those containing calomel, mercurous chloride, a compound of mercury. Calomel had been used as a medicine for centuries, valued for its powerful purgative effect. It was given to patients for everything from constipation to syphilis, and it was incorporated into many popular patent medicines of the Victorian era. The problem with calomel was that it was a mercury compound, and mercury is poisonous. Regular use of calomel caused mercury to accumulate in the body, leading to the classic symptoms of mercury poisoning: loose teeth, swollen gums, excessive salivation, and eventually damage to the nervous system. Victorian doctors were aware of these effects but continued prescribing calomel anyway, viewing the side effects as acceptable trade-offs for the drug's effectiveness. Patent medicines, proprietary formulations sold directly to consumers, were even less regulated than prescription medicines. Anyone could mix up a batch of something, give it an impressive name, and market it as a cure for whatever ailed you. The formula didn't have to be disclosed, the claims didn't have to be verified, and if customers were harmed, well, good luck proving which product caused the problem. Many patent medicines contained substantial amounts of alcohol, sometimes as much as 40%, which made them stronger than most wines and comparable to some hard liquors. This alcohol content wasn't disclosed on the label, but it certainly helped explain why these medicines made people feel better. A few spoonfuls of what was essentially fortified wine would improve almost anyone's mood, at least temporarily. Others contained opium or its derivatives, which were legal and widely available throughout the Victorian period. Laudanum, a tincture of opium in alcohol, was a common ingredient in everything from cough medicines to teething preparations for infants. It worked, in the sense that it numbed pain and induced euphoria. It was also highly addictive, and regular use created dependency that users didn't understand because they didn't know what they were taking. The patent medicine market created its own cycle of dependency, separate from but intertwined with the food adulteration problem. You ate adulterated food, you felt terrible, you took a patent medicine that made you feel better temporarily, while potentially making you worse in the long run, and so you needed to keep taking the medicine, and the medicine manufacturer was delighted to keep selling it to you. Some manufacturers deliberately designed their products to create dependency. A laxative that was too effective, for instance, could so thoroughly empty the bowels that constipation inevitably returned, requiring another dose. A stomach powder that disrupted normal acid production could create a permanent need for its continued use. The business model of many patent medicine companies depended not on curing customers, but on keeping them as customers indefinitely. The advertising for these products was shameless and extravagant by any standard. Newspapers devoted columns to testimonials from satisfied users, many of which were either fabricated or paid for. Claims of miraculous cures for every conceivable condition appeared alongside warnings about the dire consequences of leaving your symptoms untreated. Fear and hope were deployed in equal measure to separate customers from their money. One particularly insidious practice was the use of medical-sounding language and imagery to suggest scientific credibility. Products were described as containing pure or natural ingredients, implying a contrast with the adulterated food supply, even when the products themselves were just as questionable. Images of doctors and laboratories adorned packaging and advertisements, suggesting endorsement by the medical profession that might or might not actually exist. The medical profession itself was divided on the patent medicine question. Some doctors actively collaborated with medicine manufacturers, lending their names and credentials to products in exchange for payment. Others loudly condemned the entire industry as quackery and fraud. The lack of clear regulatory standards made it difficult to distinguish between legitimate medicines and outright scams, and the confusion benefited the less scrupulous operators. The financial scale of the medicine market was staggering. Victorian England spent millions of pounds annually on proprietary medicines, making it one of the most profitable industries of the era. This money came disproportionately from working-class consumers, the same people most affected by food adulteration, the same people who could least afford to waste money on ineffective remedies, the same people who had the fewest alternative sources of healthcare. The connection between food adulteration and medicine consumption wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Reformers who campaigned against food fraud often pointed to the medicine market as evidence of the harm being done. If the food supply were honest and wholesome, they argued, people wouldn't need to spend so much money on digestive remedies. The medicine industry was, in effect, profiting from the failures of the food industry, and both industries had incentives to resist reform that would disrupt their business models. Food manufacturers wanted to maintain their ability to adulterate products. Medicine manufacturers wanted people to stay sick enough to need their products. Both groups had money and influence, and both had reasons to oppose regulations that would improve public health. The reformers faced not just the inertia of the status quo, but the active resistance of powerful interests that benefited from the existing system. The same economic system that adulterated food to maximize profits created a population of chronically ill consumers who then spent their limited resources on medicines that were themselves often fraudulent. Money flowed from the poorest members of society to those who exploited them, first through the food trade and then through the medicine trade, in a double extraction that left the victims sicker and poorer at each turn. And the victims often blamed themselves. The Victorian ideology of personal responsibility meant that sickness was frequently attributed to individual moral failings, lack of self-control, poor choices, constitutional weakness. If your digestion was bad, it must be because you'd eaten too much, or eaten the wrong things, or failed to maintain proper habits. The possibility that you were being systematically poisoned by your food supply was harder to see and even harder to accept. This self-blame served the interests of the adulterators, as long as they would simply try harder to be virtuous consumers while continuing to consume the same adulterated products that were making them sick. Individual responsibility ideology in this context functioned as a cover for collective harm. The children's medicine market was particularly troubling. Parents desperate to soothe crying, sick children had access to an array of products specifically marketed for infant use. Teething powders, soothing syrups, and various preservatives promised to calm fussy babies and help them sleep. Many of these products contained opium, which certainly was effective at making babies quiet, sometimes permanently quiet when overdoses occurred. The death toll from opium-containing children's medicines is difficult to calculate, but it was certainly significant. Coroners regularly recorded deaths from accidental poisoning in infants and young children, many of which were probably attributable to well-meaning parents administering supposedly safe remedies. The babies who survived might still suffer lasting effects from early opium exposure, though these would be impossible to trace in an era before systematic health monitoring. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that many of these deaths were ultimately caused by food adulteration. A baby fed on contaminated milk gets sick. The parents, trying to help, administer a soothing syrup containing opium. The opium suppresses the symptoms without addressing the underlying problem. The parents give more medicine when the symptoms return. Eventually, the cumulative dose proves fatal, and the death is attributed to the medicine rather than to the food supply problem that started the whole cascade. This is the nature of systemic problems. They create cascades of harm that are difficult to trace and attribute. No single actor is responsible for the whole chain of events. The dairy farmer feeding distillery waste to sick cows doesn't intend to kill babies. Neither does the milkman who adds chalk to disguise watering. Neither does the medicine manufacturer whose soothing syrup contains opium. But together, through the logic of the system, they produce outcomes that none of them individually chose. Understanding this systemic nature is crucial for understanding why reform was so difficult and took so long. You couldn't fix the problem by prosecuting individual bad actors. There were too many of them, and they were all following the same economic logic. You couldn't fix it by educating consumers. They had no way to get accurate information and no alternatives even if they had. You could only fix it by changing the rules of the system itself, by creating regulations and enforcement mechanisms that would alter the incentives under which all the actors operated. That reform, as we'll see in later chapters, would eventually come, but it would take decades of investigation, publicity, and political struggle. It would require the development of new scientific methods for detecting adulteration. It would require journalists willing to publicize findings that powerful interests wanted suppressed. It would require politicians willing to vote for regulations that their campaign donors opposed. And it would require a shift in ideology, a recognition that some problems cannot be solved by individual responsibility and market forces alone, that collective action through government is sometimes necessary to protect the public from harms they cannot protect themselves against. This was not an easy sell in Victorian England, where laissez-faire economics reigned supreme and government intervention was viewed with deep suspicion. The reformers would eventually win, but the victory would be incomplete and contested at every step. The legacy of their struggle is the food safety system we enjoy today. Imperfect, certainly, but incomparably better than the free-for-all of the Victorian marketplace. Every ingredient label, every health inspection, every regulation requiring that food be what it claims to be draws a direct line back to the scandals and suffering we've been exploring. For now, though, we remain in the thick of the problem. The sausages are still full of mystery ingredients. The pies are still hiding secrets beneath their crusts. The medicine cabinets are still stocked with remedies that create as many problems as they solve. And the cycle continues. Adulterated food causing sickness, sickness driving medicine consumption enriching manufacturers who have no interest in genuine cures. The Victorian consumer stands at the centre of this system, unable to see its full dimensions, unable to trace the connections between cause and effect, able only to experience the symptoms and seek whatever relief is available at prices they can afford. They don't know that their bread contains alum, or their milk is watered, or their sausages are full of sawdust. They just know that they feel terrible much of the time, and that the medicine from the chemist shop sometimes helps and sometimes doesn't. But we're not there yet. We're still in the age of ignorance and exploitation, when caveat emptor was the only law, and the price of poverty was paid in health as well as money. The meat trade continues its mysterious transformations. The medicine trade continues its profitable predations. And somewhere, a working family sits down to a dinner of sausages and bread, followed by a spoonful of digestive powder to settle the inevitable discomfort, never knowing that the dinner caused the discomfort, and the powder might make everything worse. That's the world we've been exploring, and we're not done with it yet. There are more products to examine, more secrets to uncover, more uncomfortable truths about the way our ancestors lived and ate. But we've established the pattern now: adulteration for profit, sickness as consequence, medicine as band-aid, and the cycle repeating endlessly while the vulnerable pay the price. Keep that pattern in mind as we continue. It will help make sense of what comes next: the awakening, the investigation, the outrage, and finally the reform. The story has been dark so far, but light is coming. The Victorians eventually figured out what was happening to them and demanded better. Their success is our inheritance, and their struggle is worth remembering. The sausages await their reckoning. The medicine show is about to close, and the age of pure food is dawning on the horizon, though its full arrival is still years away. But before we move on to that brighter future, let's linger a bit longer in the present darkness, because there are aspects of the meat-medicine connection we haven't fully explored, aspects that reveal even more about the Victorian relationship with food, health, and the marketplace. Consider the position of the local butcher in all of this. Unlike the anonymous sausage manufacturer or the faceless pie maker, the butcher was a known figure in the community, someone with a face and a reputation. You might think this would create accountability, that the butcher would have incentives to sell honest products because his customers knew where to find him if something went wrong. And to some extent this was true. The best butchers built their businesses on trust, selling quality meat at fair prices and developing loyal customer bases that provided steady income. These butchers knew that their reputations were their most valuable assets, and they protected those reputations by maintaining standards. But even honest butchers operated within a compromised system. The meat they purchased from wholesalers might already be adulterated in ways they couldn't detect. The conditions of urban slaughterhouses meant that even freshly killed animals might carry diseases or contaminants that would only become apparent later. And not all butchers were honest. The same economic pressures that drove adulteration elsewhere in the food system operated in the meat trade too. A butcher who sold only premium cuts at premium prices might find himself losing customers to competitors who offered cheaper options. The temptation to economize, to stretch supplies with fillers, to sell older meat as fresh, to misrepresent the origins of products was constant and powerful. The Victorian customer had limited ability to evaluate meat quality. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly, and the line between acceptably aged and dangerously rotten was not always clear. A clever butcher could disguise the smell of spoiling meat with spices or vinegar. He could trim away the visibly rotten portions and sell the rest as fresh. He could grind questionable meat into sausages where its condition would be impossible to assess. The practice of freshening meat was widespread and widely known. Meat that was beginning to turn could be revived through various treatments: washing with chemicals, coating with preservatives, or simply masking the evidence of decay. These treatments didn't make the meat safe, they just made it saleable. The bacteria remained, the toxins accumulated, and the customer who ate the freshened meat might pay for it later with a bout of food poisoning. The slaughterhouse system that supplied urban butchers was itself a source of serious problems. Victorian slaughterhouses were scattered throughout cities, often located in residential neighbourhoods, where their presence was a constant source of nuisance and danger. The conditions inside these establishments would make a modern health inspector flee in horror. Animals were often kept in crowded, filthy conditions before slaughter, allowing diseases to spread and stress hormones to flood their flesh. The slaughtering process itself was frequently botched, with animals dying slowly and painfully rather than quickly and cleanly. Blood and offal accumulated on floors that were rarely cleaned. The workers in these establishments were among the most desperate members of the Victorian labour force. Slaughterhouse work was dangerous, disgusting, and poorly paid, a job of last resort for those who had no other options. These workers had no incentive to maintain standards that weren't enforced, and no training in practices that weren't required. The meat emerging from this system was often contaminated before it even reached the butcher's shop. Bacterial loads were high. Cross-contamination between carcasses was common. Diseases that might have been contained through proper handling spread through the supply chain instead. And all of this was invisible to the final consumer, who saw only the cut of meat on the butcher's block and had no way to trace its journey from farm to table. The distribution of meat through the city added further opportunities for contamination and fraud. Meat was transported in open carts, exposed to whatever filth the streets provided. It was handled by numerous workers, each with their own standards of hygiene, or lack thereof. It might sit for hours in warm conditions, bacteria multiplying all the while, before finally reaching the customer who would eat it. The wealthy could afford some protection from these hazards. They could purchase from the best butchers, who sourced from the best suppliers. They could afford to buy fresh meat daily rather than storing it for days. They could maintain iceboxes that slowed spoilage. And they could afford to discard meat that seemed off, rather than eating it anyway because waste was unaffordable. The poor had no such buffers. They bought from the cheapest sources, which meant the most questionable products. They bought in quantities they couldn't consume immediately because they couldn't afford daily shopping trips. They ate meat that wealthier people would have rejected because the alternative was eating no meat at all. And when they got sick, they attributed it to constitution or circumstance rather than to the compromised food supply. The seasonal patterns of meat-related illness reveal the extent of the problem. Summer months, when heat accelerated spoilage and made bacterial growth more rapid, saw spikes in food poisoning cases. Doctors recognized this pattern without fully understanding its causes. The germ theory was still being established, and the connection between microscopic organisms and disease was not yet universally accepted. What the doctors did see was a regular procession of patients suffering from what we would now recognize as food poisoning. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, and in severe cases, fever and dehydration that could be fatal. These cases were attributed to various causes: summer complaint, cholera morbus, gastric fever, but many of them were probably caused by contaminated meat consumed in a system without any safeguards. The connection between contaminated meat and specific disease outbreaks was occasionally made visible through dramatic incidents. A single batch of tainted meat served at a public function could sicken dozens of people simultaneously, making the connection unmistakable. The medicine cabinet stood ready to respond to these episodes. Stomach powders for the nausea, laxatives to expel the offending matter, tonics to restore strength afterward. The pharmaceutical industry had products for every stage of food poisoning, and Victorian households kept them well stocked in anticipation of regular need. This pharmaceutical dependency created its own health problems beyond the direct effects of the medicines themselves. The ease of treating symptoms discouraged investigation of causes. Why examine the meat supply when you could simply take a powder and feel better? Why demand reform when the immediate problem could be managed with a trip to the chemist's shop? The normalisation of digestive distress in Victorian society is remarkable to modern eyes. Contemporary accounts suggest that stomach problems were simply expected as a regular part of life. People didn't question why they so often felt unwell after eating. They just accepted it as normal and reached for their preferred remedy. This acceptance was both a consequence of the adulterated food supply and a barrier to reform. As long as people thought their problems were inevitable, they wouldn't demand change. Children, as always, were particularly vulnerable. Their smaller bodies and developing systems were less able to withstand the assault of contaminated food and questionable medicine. A bout of food poisoning that might leave an adult feeling miserable for a day or two could kill a child. The mortality statistics for Victorian children are shocking by modern standards, and contaminated food was a significant contributor. The doctors who treated these children were often frustrated by the limitations of their ability to help. They could treat symptoms, but they couldn't address the underlying causes. They could advise better hygiene and more careful food selection, but their patients often lacked the resources to follow this advice. They could watch children sicken and die from preventable causes, knowing that the system producing those causes was beyond their power to change. Some doctors became advocates for reform, using their professional authority to speak out about the dangers of food adulteration. They published articles, gave lectures, and testified before parliamentary committees about the health consequences they observed in their practices. These medical voices would eventually become important parts of the Reform Coalition, lending scientific credibility to what might otherwise have seemed like mere consumer complaints. But in the meantime, the system continued to operate as it always had. The pie makers stretched their filling with whatever was cheapest. The chemists sold their powders and potions. And the public consumed it all, sick and healthy and sick again, trapped in a cycle they couldn't escape because they couldn't see it clearly. The advertising that surrounded all these products, both the food and the medicines, worked to maintain this blindness. Medicine advertisements emphasized efficacy and relief, regardless of whether the products worked or were even safe. The consumer navigating this marketplace of claims had no way to distinguish truth from falsehood, no independent source of information to consult, no regulatory body to trust. In this environment, skepticism was actually counterproductive. A consumer who questioned everything would be paralyzed, unable to make any purchase at all. People chose to believe that their food was probably fine and their medicine probably worked, because the alternative was too uncomfortable to contemplate. This psychological dynamic benefited the adulterators and fraudsters while harming their victims. The maintenance of normalcy required ignoring evidence of systematic problems. The will to believe in the marketplace's benevolence meant overlooking its actual malevolence. And the cycle continued, profit flowing upward and harm flowing downward, while everyone pretended that everything was basically fine. Breaking this cycle would require a fundamental disruption of the pretense, a revelation so shocking that it could not be ignored, evidence so clear that it could not be explained away, and a reform movement strong enough to overcome the entrenched interests that benefited from the status quo. That disruption was coming, in the form of scientific investigations, journalistic exposés, and parliamentary action. But first, the system had to reach its breaking point. The accumulation of harm, the weight of evidence, the growing outrage of a public slowly awakening to what was being done to them. All of this had to build to a critical mass before change became possible. We're approaching that point in our story, though we haven't reached it yet. The meat pies are still being sold. The sausages are still being consumed. The medicines are still being swallowed. And the cycle continues, as it has continued for decades, grinding profit from suffering and suffering from profit. The Victorian marketplace churns on, indifferent to the harm it causes, responsive only to the logic of commerce and the pressures of competition. But somewhere, a scientist is testing food samples. Somewhere, a journalist is gathering evidence. Somewhere, a reformer is preparing to speak out. The age of ignorance is ending, slowly, painfully, through the accumulation of facts and the persistence of people who refuse to accept that the status quo is acceptable. That story, the story of how things changed, will come in later chapters. For now, we've established the depth of the problem, the systematic adulteration of the food supply, the cascade of health consequences, the pharmaceutical industry profiting from the resulting illness, and the psychological mechanisms that kept people from recognizing and responding to their collective victimization. It's a dark picture, but it's one worth understanding. Because the forces that created this situation, the pursuit of profit, the absence of regulation, the information asymmetry between producers and consumers, haven't disappeared. They still operate in markets around the world, still create victims where oversight is absent, still generate the same cycles of exploitation we've been describing. The Victorian experience is thus not just history, it's a lesson. It shows us what happens when markets are left entirely to their own devices, when the only rule is caveat emptor, when the vulnerable are left to fend for themselves against those who would exploit them. It also shows us that change is possible, that systems can be reformed, that people working together can create protections that benefit everyone. We'll see that process of reform unfold in the chapters to come. For now, let's leave the meat trade and the medicine cabinet where they are, deeply problematic, widely accepted, and awaiting the reckoning that will eventually come. The pies and sausages will give up their secrets. The powders and potions will be examined and found wanting. And the Victorian public will finally learn what they've been consuming all along. That awakening is coming. But first, there's more darkness to traverse, more victims to count, more lessons to learn. The story continues, and so does our journey through the Victorian marketplace of adulteration and fraud. And now, finally, we arrive at the turning point in our story. The moment when the darkness we've been describing began to lift. When the systematic poisoning of the British public started to become visible. When someone finally looked at the food supply and asked the simple question, what exactly is in this stuff? The answer, as we've seen, was horrifying. But someone had to discover that horror, document it, and make it public before anything could change. That someone turned out to be a collection of scientists, doctors, and concerned citizens who took it upon themselves to investigate what everyone else was trying not to see. Armed with microscopes, test tubes, and the emerging tools of analytical chemistry, they set out to examine the food that millions of people consumed every day, and what they found would eventually shock a nation into action. The hero of this chapter isn't a single person, but a type. The analytical chemist, the early food investigator, the person who looked at a loaf of bread or a jar of jam and asked what secrets it was hiding. These were not official inspectors, there was no such thing yet. They were one of the earliest and most important of these investigators was a physician named Frederick Ackum, a German-born chemist who had settled in London and built a reputation as an expert in chemistry and its applications. In 1820, Ackum published a book with a title that left nothing to the imagination. A treatise on adulterations of food and culinary poisons. The frontispiece featured a rather dramatic image of a skull surrounded by symbolic serpents, just in case readers hadn't gotten the message from the title. Ackum's book was a sensation. For the first, Ackum didn't deal in vague suspicions or unsubstantiated rumours. He named names, described methods, and provided chemical tests that readers could use to detect adulteration themselves. He explained how bread was whitened with alum, how beer was doctored with various toxic substances, how tea was padded with leaves from other plants and coloured with poisonous dyes. He even included the names of specific tradesmen who had been convicted of adulteration offences, turning his scientific treatise into something approaching investigative journalism. The reaction was explosive. The book went through multiple editions and was widely discussed in newspapers and magazines. The food trade, unsurprisingly, was rather less enthusiastic about Ackum's work. His naming of names made him powerful enemies, and within a few years he had been driven out of England by what appeared to be a coordinated campaign to destroy his reputation. The circumstances were murky. He was accused of tearing pages from books in the library of the Royal Institution, a charge that many believed was trumped up. But the effect was clear. Ackum returned to Germany and never published on food adulteration again. But you can't unring a bell, and Ackum's revelations had planted seeds that would eventually grow into a full-scale reform movement. The public now knew that adulteration was real, systematic, and dangerous. They might not have had the power to do anything about it immediately, but the knowledge was out there, waiting for its moment. That moment came a generation later, in the 1850s, when a new generation of investigators took up the cause with even more rigorous scientific methods and even more dramatic revelations. The leader of this new wave was Arthur Hill Hassall, a physician who combined medical training with a passion for microscopy, the science of examining objects through magnifying lenses. Hassall's innovation was simple but revolutionary. He realized that the microscope could reveal adulteration that was invisible to the naked eye. A loaf of bread might look perfectly normal, but under magnification the structures of different substances became visible. Alum crystals didn't look like flour particles. Chalk didn't look like ground wheat. With a good microscope and sufficient skill, an investigator could determine what was actually in a food sample, regardless of what the seller claimed it contained. Starting in 1851, Hassall began systematically examining food products purchased from shops around London. He bought bread, milk, coffee, tea, sugar, pepper, mustard, everything that ordinary consumers would purchase for their households. Then he took these samples back to his laboratory and examined them under the microscope, documenting exactly what he found. The results were damning. Of the samples Hassall examined, the vast majority were adulterated in some way. His coffee samples contained chicory, roasted beans, and various other substances that were not coffee. His tea was padded with used leaves that had been dried and recoloured for resale. His bread contained alum. His milk was watered and chalked. His pepper was extended with ground rice and floor sweepings. Almost nothing was what it claimed to be. Hassall didn't keep these findings to himself. He partnered with Thomas Wackley, the crusading editor of the medical journal The Lancet, to publish his results in a series of articles that ran from 1851 to 1854. The Analytical Sanitary Commission, as the series was called, combined Hassall's scientific analysis with Wackley's journalistic flair, presenting findings in a way that was both rigorous and readable. And here's where it got really interesting. Hassall named names. Not just the types of products that were adulterated, but the specific shops where he'd bought them. A grocer on Oxford Street might open the Lancet to discover that his coffee had been publicly identified as containing 50% chicory. A baker in Cheapside might find his bread exposed as full of alum. For the first time, individual tradesmen faced public accountability for the products they sold. The reaction from the trade was predictable: fury, denial, and threats of legal action. Some of the named traders tried to sue Hassall and Wackley for libel. But the beautiful thing about scientific analysis is that it produces evidence. When a grocer claimed his coffee was pure and Hassall had microscope slides showing it was half chicory, the evidence spoke for itself. The libel suits generally went nowhere, and the exposure continued. The impact on public opinion was profound. Here was proof, not rumour, not suspicion, but actual scientific documentation that the food supply was systematically compromised. The reports were discussed in newspapers, debated in Parliament, and talked about in households across the country. Hassall's work built on and extended Occam's earlier investigations, but with important differences. Where Occam had been silenced and driven away, Hassall had the protection of the Lancet's platform and the growing public demand for information. The moment was right for exposure, and Hassall delivered. But Hassall was far from the only investigator working on food adulteration during this period. Across England, other chemists and physicians were conducting their own analyses, contributing to a growing body of evidence about the extent and nature of the problem. Some of these investigators focused on specific products. John Postgate, a surgeon from Birmingham, became particularly concerned about bread adulteration after treating patients whose symptoms he attributed to alum consumption. He conducted his own analyses of bread samples, confirming Hassall's findings and adding his voice to the growing chorus demanding reform. Others focused on specific geographic areas, documenting adulteration patterns in their local markets. These local investigations were important because they showed that the problem wasn't limited to London. It existed everywhere, in every city and town where commercial food production had taken hold. The methods these investigators used were often ingenious, given the limited tools available to them. Chemical tests could detect the presence of specific substances, a reaction that produced a particular colour when alum was present, for instance, or a precipitate that formed when lead compounds were in solution. Microscopy could reveal structures and particles that chemical tests might miss. The combination of these methods created a powerful toolkit for exposing adulteration. Some investigators developed tests that consumers could conduct themselves, democratizing the ability to detect fraud. A simple test for watered milk involved floating a steel needle on the surface. Pure milk had enough fat to support the needle, while watered milk didn't. A test for alarm in bread involved adding a chemical solution that would turn blue in the presence of aluminum compounds. These home tests were imperfect, but they gave ordinary people some ability to evaluate what they were buying. The publication of these tests had interesting effects on the marketplace. Some vendors, knowing that customers might test their products, began selling less adulterated goods to avoid exposure. Others simply adapted their adulterations to evade the specific tests that had been publicized. It was a cat-and-mouse game, with investigators developing new detection methods and adulterators finding new ways to hide their practices. The scientific community was not universally supportive of the food investigators. Some chemists felt that the public exposure of adulteration was undignified, that scientists should confine themselves to abstract research rather than engaging with commercial controversies. Others had financial relationships with food manufacturers and were reluctant to bite the hands that funded their laboratories. The politics of science, then as now, were complicated, but the momentum was building. Each new investigation added to the pile of evidence. Each new publication increased public awareness. Each new scandal, and there were many, as the investigators kept finding new horrors to expose, added to the pressure for something to be done. Let's pause here and consider what these investigations actually looked like in practice, because the romanticism of scientists exposing fraud can obscure the mundane reality of the work. Imagine Arthur Hassall on a typical working day in 1852. He's not in a gleaming modern laboratory with precise instruments and climate control. He's in a modest room, probably in his own home, equipped with a microscope, some chemical reagents, and a collection of food samples that he's purchased from shops around the city. The lighting is natural. Gaslight or candles would interfere with microscope work, so he has to schedule his examinations around the availability of daylight. He takes a sample of coffee from a paper bag purchased earlier in the week. Using a small spatula, he places a tiny amount on a glass slide and adds a drop of water to spread it thin. He positions the slide under his microscope and adjusts the focus, peering through the eyepiece at the magnified image. What he sees is not uniform. Real coffee, ground from roasted beans, has a distinctive cellular structure that's recognizable under magnification. But mixed in with the coffee cells are other structures, the characteristic appearance of chicory root, the starch grains of wheat or barley, and perhaps other substances he can't immediately identify. He makes careful notes, sketches what he observes, and records the shop where the sample was purchased. This process is repeated for dozens of samples, different coffees from different vendors, teas, sugars, peppers, mustards, breads, milk, butter, and whatever else catches his attention. Each examination takes time. Each finding must be documented carefully enough to withstand the legal challenges that will inevitably come when he publishes. The equipment Hassel used was simple by modern standards, but represented the cutting edge of mid-19th century science. His microscope was probably a compound instrument with multiple lenses, capable of magnifications of several hundred times. This was enough to reveal cellular structures and particles that would be invisible to the naked eye, though not enough for the detailed analysis that modern electron microscopes allow. His chemical tests relied on reagents that were themselves not always pure, an ironic problem for someone investigating adulteration. The samples he examined were purchased anonymously, like any ordinary customer would buy them. This was important for the credibility of his findings. If vendors knew that the scientist Dr. Hassel, by buying anonymously and then revealing the source only in publication, Hassel ensured that his findings reflected what ordinary customers were actually receiving. The publication of results in The Lancet followed a regular format. Each article would describe the product being examined, the methods used for analysis, and the findings for each sample tested. Vendors were identified by name and address, making it impossible for them to hide behind anonymity. The articles were written in language accessible to educated general readers, not just medical professionals, maximizing their public impact. The naming of names was controversial but deliberate. Hassel and Walkley believed that only public exposure would create enough pressure to change behavior. Anonymous descriptions of adulteration practices might educate the public, but they wouldn't hold anyone accountable. By identifying specific wrongdoers, they created consequences for adulteration that hadn't existed before. Some of the name vendors protested vigorously, claiming their products were pure and that Hassel's analysis was flawed. A few brought legal action, but in the adversarial setting of a courtroom, Hassel's meticulous documentation proved invaluable. He could produce his notes, his slides, his chemical tests, and walk the jury through exactly how he had reached his conclusions. The weight of evidence generally proved overwhelming. Other vendors, perhaps more wisely, simply improved their practices rather than fighting the findings. A grocer whose coffee had been exposed as adulterated might quietly begin selling purer product, hoping to avoid further negative publicity. In this way, the investigations had immediate practical effects even before any legislation was passed. The investigations also revealed the structure of the adulteration industry, the supply chains that provided adulterants to manufacturers, the wholesale networks that distributed adulterated products, the retail practices that passed them on to consumers. This systemic view was important for understanding that adulteration wasn't just a matter of individual bad actors, but a structural problem requiring structural solutions. You could purchase alum for bread whitening, chicory for coffee extending, and various colouring agents for whatever purpose you had in mind. These suppliers weren't hiding. They were serving a recognised market need. Only when that need was criminalised would the supply chains begin to disappear. The investigators also documented the economic logic of adulteration, showing how competitive pressure drove honest operators to either adopt dishonest practices or go out of business. This analysis was crucial for the reform argument. It showed that moral exhortation alone wouldn't solve the problem. As long as adulteration was profitable and unpoliced, it would continue. Only regulation could change the economic calculus. The scientific methods themselves were advancing during this period, providing increasingly powerful tools for detection. Spectroscopy, the analysis of light absorbed or emitted by substances was beginning to reveal its potential for chemical identification. Quantitative analysis techniques allowed investigators to determine not just whether a substance was present, but how much of it was present. These advances meant that adulterators were facing an increasingly sophisticated opposition. The knowledge gap that had protected adulterators for so long was beginning to close. Where once they could assume that no one would check their products, now they had to worry that any sample might end up under a microscope. Where once their adulterations were invisible, now they could be detected and documented. The asymmetry of information that had defined the Victorian marketplace was being challenged by the power of scientific investigation. But investigation alone wasn't enough. The findings had to be disseminated, debated, and ultimately translated into political action. This required communication skills that went beyond laboratory technique. The ability to write compellingly, to speak persuasively, to navigate the complex world of Victorian media and politics. The Lancet provided one crucial platform, but it wasn't the only one. Newspaper editorial writers thundered against the poisoners of the public. Feature articles explored the world of adulteration in lurid detail. Public lectures brought the findings to audiences beyond the reading public. Scientists and physicians spoke at mechanics institutes, literary societies and public halls, explaining adulteration to crowds that might never read the Lancet but were intensely interested in what they were eating. These lectures combined education with entertainment, often including demonstrations of chemical tests and displays of microscopic images. The visual element was particularly powerful. Seeing these demonstrations converted abstract knowledge into personal experience, making the problem real in a way that printed descriptions couldn't quite achieve. When a member rose to speak in favor of food regulation, they could cite specific findings, name specific products, quote specific percentages of adulteration. The food industry and its political allies argued that the investigations were exaggerated, that a few bad actors were being used to smear an entire trade, that government regulation would burden honest businesses while failing to stop the dishonest ones. These arguments would continue throughout the reform debates, and they never entirely disappeared. But the weight of evidence relentlessly accumulated by the investigators eventually proved too heavy to ignore. The Bradford poisoning of 1858 added urgency to the reform cause. We've mentioned this incident before, the accidental substitution of arsenic for a sugar adulterant, resulting in over 20 deaths and hundreds of illnesses. This was food adulteration made suddenly, dramatically visible, a body count that couldn't be explained away or minimized. The Bradford tragedy wasn't a result of deliberate poisoning. It was a consequence of systemic carelessness, of a supply chain so accustomed to handling toxic substances as routine ingredients that a fatal mix-up became possible. The confectioner who made the poisoned sweets didn't intend to kill anyone. He thought he was using the same adulterant he'd always used. But the system that normalized adulteration also normalized the handling of dangerous substances in contexts where mistakes could be fatal. The investigators' response to Bradford was to intensify their work, to show that this tragedy was not an isolated incident, but a particularly visible symptom of a much larger disease. They documented the widespread use of toxic substances in food production, the casual handling of poisons in commercial contexts, the complete absence of safeguards against exactly the kind of accident that had occurred. Bradford, they argued, was what happened when adulteration was allowed to run unchecked. And Bradford could happen again, anywhere, any time, as long as the system remained unreformed. The public response to Bradford was outrage on a scale that previous revelations hadn't achieved. Dead children have a way of focusing attention that statistical evidence doesn't. The abstract knowledge that food was adulterated became concrete horror when it was associated with small coffins and grieving families. Even those who had been willing to tolerate adulteration as a minor annoyance found themselves forced to confront its potentially lethal consequences. Parliament, pushed by public pressure and armed with the evidence that investigators had gathered, began to act. The first serious legislation, the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860, was a modest beginning. It prohibited the addition of harmful substances to food, but provided weak enforcement mechanisms. Still, it represented a crucial shift. For the first time, the government had acknowledged that food safety was a matter for legislation, rather than being left entirely to the market. The 1860 Act was just a first step, and the investigators knew it. The law had loopholes large enough to drive a wagon full of adulterated bread through. Enforcement was left to local authorities who often lacked the expertise or the will to pursue cases. Penalties were light enough that they could be treated as a cost of doing business rather than a genuine deterrent. So the investigators kept working, kept documenting, kept publishing. They monitored the effectiveness of the new law and reported on its failures. They identified continuing adulteration and called for stronger measures. They provided the evidence base for subsequent legislation that would gradually close loopholes and strengthen enforcement. The 1872 Adulteration of Food, Drink and Drugs Act was a significant improvement, creating a system of public analysts who could officially test food samples and giving local authorities clearer powers to prosecute adulteration. This law created jobs for chemists, official positions dedicated to food testing, and began building the institutional infrastructure for ongoing food safety enforcement. The investigators of the 1850s became the public analysts of the 1870s. Their ad hoc private efforts transformed into official public functions. The skills they had developed, the methods they had pioneered, the evidence they had gathered, all of this flowed into the new regulatory system, providing the foundation for modern food safety. But the transition wasn't smooth or complete. Many local authorities were slow to appoint analysts, reluctant to spend money on food testing when other demands seemed more pressing. Some analysts were poorly trained or inadequately equipped, unable to conduct the sophisticated analyses that effective enforcement required. The food industry continued to resist regulation, fighting against each new requirement and exploiting every loophole. The investigators, now inside the system rather than outside it, had to navigate new challenges. As public employees, they faced pressures from local politicians who might have their own relationships with the food trade. They had to balance their scientific independence with administrative constraints. They had to work within budgets that were never quite adequate for the scope of the problem. And yet progress happened. Slowly, fitfully, imperfectly, but real progress nonetheless. Consumers gained access to food that was, if not perfectly pure, at least less systematically poisoned than before. The worst offenders were prosecuted and punished, creating deterrents that had never existed in the unregulated marketplace. The investigators had achieved something remarkable. They had used the power of scientific evidence to force political change in the face of entrenched interests. They had shown that knowledge could be a weapon against exploitation, that transparency could disrupt systems of fraud, that determined individuals could make a difference even against powerful opposition. The pattern they established, systematic investigation, public disclosure, political pressure, legislative reform, institutional enforcement, has been repeated in countless other contexts where scientific evidence has driven social change. The tools have changed, of course. Modern analytical chemistry can detect substances at parts per billion that Victorian microscopes couldn't have glimpsed. But the basic pattern remains: gather evidence, make it public, demand action, build institutions to maintain progress. It's a formula that works when someone is willing to do the work. The Victorian food investigators weren't saints or superheroes. They had their own interests and limitations, their own blind spots and biases. Some were motivated by genuine concern for public health, others by professional ambition or political ideology. The purity of their motives doesn't change the value of their work. They gathered evidence that needed to be gathered, exposed truths that needed to be exposed, and contributed to changes that needed to happen. And in the process, they helped create the food safety systems that protect us today. Every time you read an ingredient label, you're benefiting from their work. Every time a food inspector visits a restaurant, they're following in their footsteps. Every regulation that prevents manufacturers from adding lead to candy or arsenic to bread draws on precedents they established. The age of ignorance was ending. The chemists with their test tubes and microscopes had opened windows into the Victorian food supply that couldn't be closed. The public knew now what they were eating, and they weren't going to forget. The pressure for reform would only increase from here, building toward the comprehensive food safety legislation of the late 19th century and beyond. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The investigators had done their work, but the work of turning their findings into lasting change was still incomplete. There were more battles to fight, more resistance to overcome, more progress to secure. The story continues, and the journey from discovery to reform is longer than it might appear from this distance. The evidence is in. Now comes the harder work of turning evidence into action, science into policy, knowledge into power. That work would take years, would face setbacks as well as victories, and would require sustained effort from people who refused to give up, even when progress seemed impossibly slow. But the investigators had proven that adulteration could be detected, documented, and publicized. They had shown that scientific evidence could pierce the veil of commercial secrecy that had protected adulterators for so long. They had created a model for food safety investigation that would be adopted, adapted, and refined for generations to come. The awakening had begun. The chemists had done their part. Now it was time for the public, the press, and the politicians to do theirs. The fight for pure food was entering its next phase, and the outcome was still far from certain, but at least finally the fight was truly joined. But let's return to the laboratories and the investigators for a moment longer, because there are stories and details we haven't fully explored, moments that reveal the human drama behind the scientific work, and incidents that show just how revolutionary this investigative approach really was. Consider the peculiar position of the analyst who discovers something genuinely horrifying in a food sample. You've purchased a jar of jam from a respectable-looking shop, expecting to find perhaps some added apple pulp or glucose syrup stretching the strawberries. Instead, your analysis reveals something far worse. Copper salts used for colouring, perhaps, or evidence of decomposed fruit that should have been discarded weeks ago. You have a choice: publish the finding and face the inevitable legal challenges and personal attacks, or quietly set aside the sample and move on to something less controversial. The investigators of the 1850s and 60s consistently chose to publish, even when the findings were explosive, even when the consequences for themselves might be severe. This took courage of a particular kind, not the dramatic courage of physical danger, but the steady courage required to persist in unpopular truth-telling despite social and professional pressure. Some investigators paid real prices for their work. We've already mentioned Frederick Ockham's exile from England following what many believed to be a coordinated campaign to destroy his reputation. Others faced less dramatic but still significant consequences. Social ostracism, loss of business relationships, difficulties in their professional careers. The food trade had money and connections, and it wasn't above using them against those who threatened its profits. The investigators who succeeded were those who managed to build enough support, whether from the press, from medical colleagues, from public opinion, to withstand these pressures. Arthur Hassel's partnership with Thomas Whately at the Lancet was crucial in this regard. Whately was himself a formidable figure, a radical politician as well as a medical editor, someone who had spent his career picking fights with established interests and knew how to win them. His backing gave us all protection that independent investigators lacked. The network of investigators was informal but effective. Doctors who observed patterns of illness that seemed connected to food contamination passed their observations to chemists who could investigate further. Journalists, this collaborative approach multiplied the impact of individual efforts. The laboratories where this work occurred were typically modest affairs, nothing like the gleaming research facilities we might imagine today. Others had access to institutional laboratories, but these were often cramped and poorly equipped by modern standards. The work was done not with generous research budgets, but with whatever resources the investigators could scrape together, often at their own expense. The equipment itself was a constant source of frustration. Chemical reagents were often impure, as we've mentioned, requiring investigators to test their own supplies before trusting their results. Glass containers, measuring instruments, heat sources, everything required careful attention, because errors in the analytical process could undermine the entire enterprise. The documentation requirements added another layer of difficulty. It wasn't enough to detect adulteration. You had to prove it in a way that would withstand challenge. This meant keeping meticulous records of every step, where the sample was purchased, when it was analysed, what methods were used, what results were obtained. The investigator had to imagine a hostile cross-examination and ensure that every aspect of the work could withstand scrutiny. When legal challenges did come, the investigator's records proved crucial. A well-documented analysis could convince a jury even when the defendant's lawyers were aggressive and well-funded. The weight of evidence, carefully assembled and clearly presented, was difficult to overcome through mere rhetoric. This was science as legal weapon, and it proved remarkably effective. When an investigator could set up a microscope in a public hall and invite audience members to look for themselves, the impact was immediate and personal. People who might have dismissed printed reports as exaggeration found themselves staring at the evidence with their own eyes. There was no arguing with what you could see. They would set up comparisons, placing a sample of genuine product next to an adulterated sample and inviting the audience to spot the difference through the microscope. They would conduct chemical tests before live audiences, showing how reagents changed colour in the presence of adulterants. They transformed what could have been dry scientific lectures into compelling demonstrations that audiences remembered and discussed. The newspapers loved these demonstrations and reported them enthusiastically. A particularly dramatic revelation, the discovery of a new adulterant, or the exposure of a previously trusted vendor, could make headlines and spark public discussion. The investigators became minor celebrities, their names known to readers who might never have encountered scientific research in any other context. This public profile had both advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, it gave the investigators influence they couldn't have achieved through publications alone. On the other hand, it made them targets, subjected them to scrutiny that might reveal any weakness in their methods or character, and created pressure to produce ever more dramatic findings that might tempt some toward exaggeration. The investigators who maintained their credibility over time were those who kept their commitment to accuracy, even when the pressure for sensation was strong. The resistance from the food trade took many forms beyond the legal challenges we've mentioned. Trade associations published pamphlets defending their members and attacking the investigators' methods. Friendly newspapers ran articles questioning whether adulteration was really as widespread as claimed. Political allies raised objections in Parliament, arguing that regulation would harm legitimate businesses while failing to stop the truly unscrupulous operators. Some of these objections had elements of truth. Regulation could be burdensome for small operators. Enforcement was unlikely to be perfect. Some of the investigators' findings were open to interpretation, and reasonable people might disagree about what constituted unacceptable adulteration versus acceptable commercial practice. The lines weren't always as clear as the reform rhetoric suggested, but the weight of evidence was simply too great to explain away. When investigation after investigation found the same patterns of adulteration, when the findings were replicated by independent analysts using different methods, when the health consequences were visible in doctors' offices and hospitals across the country, the denials began to sound hollow. The trade could delay reform, could weaken specific provisions, could complain loudly about unfair treatment, but it couldn't stop the overall momentum toward regulation. The international dimension added another interesting element to the story. Food adulteration was not uniquely British. It was happening everywhere that industrialization and urbanization had created similar market conditions. Investigators in France, Germany, and the United States were conducting their own analyses, finding their own patterns of fraud, building their own cases for reform. This international context reinforced the British findings while also creating competitive pressure. No country wanted to be seen as tolerating worse food safety than its rivals. The exchange of information between investigators in different countries accelerated the development of detection methods. A technique developed in Germany might be adopted in England and improved upon in France. Scientific journals published in multiple languages spread findings across borders. International conferences brought investigators together to share experiences and coordinate approaches. The fight for pure food was becoming a global movement, though the specific forms it took varied by national context. The involved doctors could speak with authority about the health consequences of adulteration, drawing on their clinical experience with patients whose illnesses could be traced to contaminated food. Their testimony carried weight with legislators who might dismiss the concerns of chemists as technical quibbles, but couldn't ignore the judgment of physicians about threats to public health. Some of the most powerful advocacy came from doctors who had witnessed the effects of adulteration firsthand. A physician who had treated children poisoned by lead-laced candy, or adults suffering chronic illness from alum-contaminated bread, could speak with a conviction that no amount of laboratory analysis could match. These personal testimonies, combined with the scientific evidence, created a powerful 1-2 punch that proved difficult to counter. The reformers also made effective use of moral rhetoric, framing adulteration not just as a public health issue but as a matter of justice and decency. The poisoning of the poor, the exploitation of those who couldn't protect themselves, the corruption of something as fundamental as the food supply. These were presented as moral outrages that demanded response regardless of economic considerations. This framing appealed to the Victorian sense of moral duty and helped build a coalition that extended beyond those directly affected by adulteration. Religious voices joined the cause, arguing that adulteration was a form of theft and deception that violated divine law as well as human welfare. Sermons were preached about the sinfulness of trading in poisoned food. Church organizations supported reform efforts and provided platforms for spreading the message. The moral dimension of food purity resonated with a society that took religious and ethical considerations seriously. The investigators themselves generally avoided overt moralizing in their scientific publications, preferring to let the facts speak for themselves. But they understood the power of moral framing and were willing to cooperate with those who could deploy it effectively. The coalition that emerged combined scientific credibility with moral urgency, each reinforcing the other. As the first Adulteration Act of 1860 was widely recognised as inadequate, but it had established the principle that government could and should regulate food safety. Subsequent debates focused on strengthening the law, improving enforcement, and closing the loopholes that clever adulterators continued to exploit. The investigators remained essential to these ongoing debates. Their continued monitoring of the food supply provided evidence of what was working and what wasn't. When a particular type of adulteration persisted despite the new law, their documentation made the case for tighter regulation. When enforcement proved inadequate, their findings demonstrated the consequences of that failure. The creation of official public analyst positions represented a kind of victory for the investigators, turning their ad hoc private efforts into institutionalized public functions. But institutionalization brought its own challenges. Public analysts had to work within bureaucratic constraints, balance scientific independence with administrative responsibilities, and maintain their effectiveness despite limited budgets and sometimes hostile local politics. Some of the pioneers of food investigation transitioned into these official roles, bringing their expertise and commitment into the new system. Others remained outside, continuing their independent work while supporting their colleagues who had moved inside. The relationship between official and unofficial investigation would remain important for decades, with each complementing the other's strengths and compensating for the other's limitations. The legacy of these Victorian investigators extends far beyond their immediate achievements. They established that scientific evidence could be a tool for social reform, that systematic investigation could reveal hidden harms, and that public disclosure could create pressure for change that would otherwise never occur. These principles have been applied in countless other contexts, from environmental protection to workplace safety to pharmaceutical regulation. The methods they developed, careful sampling, controlled analysis, meticulous documentation, public reporting, remain the foundation of regulatory science today. Modern food safety testing is infinitely more sophisticated in its technology, but follows the same basic logic. Examine products systematically, identify problems, report findings, and use the evidence to drive improvement. The institutions they helped create, food inspection agencies, public health laboratories, regulatory bodies with enforcement powers, have evolved but continue to serve the essential functions they identified. The infrastructure of food safety that protects us today is built on foundations they laid, brick by scientific brick, in the laboratories and lecture halls of Victorian England. And the lesson they taught, that markets left entirely to themselves will sometimes produce harmful outcomes that only collective action can address, remains relevant in every generation. The forces that drove Victorian adulteration haven't disappeared, they've just found new contexts and new forms. The need for vigilance, for investigation, for public accountability is permanent, not something that can be achieved once and then forgotten. The chemists with their test tubes have done their work. The awakening they sparked continues to this day, in every laboratory where products are tested, every report where findings are published, every regulation where public health is protected. Their victory wasn't final, no victory in public health ever is, but it was real, and it matters, and it deserves to be remembered. The samples are analysed, the reports are filed, and the evidence is in the public record. Now come the questions of what to do with that evidence, how to turn scientific findings into political reality, how to overcome the resistance that will inevitably arise when powerful interests are challenged. That work belongs to others, activists, journalists, politicians, who will take up the cause and carry it forward. But the foundation has been laid, the truth is known, and the fight for pure food, armed with the weapons that science has provided, is about to enter its next phase. The scientists had done their work in laboratories, peering through microscopes and conducting chemical tests. But science alone doesn't change society. For the findings of the investigators to matter, they had to reach the people who were actually eating the adulterated food. The millions of ordinary consumers who had been the unwitting victims of fraud for generations. This chapter is about how that happened, about how information spread from scientific journals to kitchen tables, and about how ordinary people became active participants in the fight for pure food. The heroes of this chapter aren't famous scientists or crusading journalists. They're the housewives who started testing their own groceries, the local activists who organised meetings and circulated pamphlets, the shoppers who confronted vendors and demanded answers, the These were the foot soldiers of the pure food movement, and without them, all the laboratory work in the world would have meant nothing. Let's start with the housewife, because she occupied a peculiarly important position in this struggle. In Victorian England, household management was primarily women's work. It was the wife and mother who purchased food, prepared meals, and worried about the health of her family. She was the one who noticed when the milk seemed thin, when the bread didn't rise properly, when the children got sick after eating sweets. She was, in other words, the frontline observer of food quality, and the first victim when that quality failed. For most of history, the housewife's observations remained private, shared perhaps with neighbours and relatives, but never reaching a wider audience. She might suspect that something was wrong with the food she was buying, but she had no way to confirm those suspicions and no platform from which to voice them. Her knowledge was experiential, anecdotal, and easily dismissed by those with vested interests in denying the problem. The publication of the investigators' findings changed this dynamic fundamentally. Now the housewife's suspicions were validated by scientific authority. That milk she had thought seemed watery? The experts confirmed it was probably diluted. That bread that didn't satisfy like it used to? The analysts had found it full of alum and chalk. Her intuitions, which had been easy to dismiss as women's fancies, were now backed by chemical tests and microscopic analysis. Women who had doubted their own perceptions now felt confident that their observations were accurate. Women who had been reluctant to complain now had evidence to cite. Women who had felt powerless against the combined forces of commerce and male authority now had science on their side. The investigators had given them weapons, and they were ready to use them. The simplest weapon was the home test. We've mentioned these before: the needle floating on milk to detect watering, the chemical solution that turned blue in the presence of alum. These tests were imperfect, certainly, but they gave consumers something they had never had before, an independent way to check whether they were being cheated. Recipes for home tests spread through women's magazines, domestic advice books, and word of the mouth. A woman who learned a test from her neighbour would teach it to her sister, who would share it with her friends, who would pass it along to their daughters. The knowledge propagated through social networks that predated and paralleled the formal channels of scientific publication. Some of these tests were quite ingenious. To test for chicory in coffee, you could spread a spoonful on water and watch what happened. Pure coffee floated and released a clear brownish colour. Chicory sank and released a distinctive reddish tint. The test didn't require any special equipment or chemicals, just water, patience, and a suspicious mind. To test for alum in bread, you could crush a piece and add a solution of logwood extract, which was readily available from apothecaries. If alum was present, the mixture would turn blue. Again, the test was simple enough for anyone to conduct in their own kitchen, using materials that were cheap and accessible. These home tests had their limitations, of course. They could produce false positives or misadulterations that more sophisticated analysis would detect. They required some skill to conduct properly, and inexperienced testers might misinterpret their results. But they gave ordinary consumers a sense of agency, a feeling that they could do something about the problem rather than simply accepting whatever the market provided. The psychological impact of this agency shouldn't be underestimated. When you can test your own food, you're no longer a passive victim. You're an active participant in quality control, capable of detecting fraud and responding to it. Even if you become a skeptical consumer rather than a trusting one, alert to problems and ready to act when you find them. The vendors, of course, were not pleased by this development. A customer who tested their purchases was a customer who might discover adulteration and cause trouble. Some vendors responded by improving their products. If customers were going to test, better to pass the test than face the consequences of failure. This cat-and-mouse dynamic created pressure for ever more sophisticated testing methods. As vendors learned to evade the simple tests, investigators developed more complex ones, which were then simplified and popularized for home use, which prompted further evasion, and so on. The arms race between adulterators and detectors accelerated, with consumers and their home tests playing an increasingly important role. Beyond testing, the housewife had another powerful tool: her purchasing power. Victorian households typically bought food from local vendors whom they dealt with repeatedly. A vendor who gained a reputation for selling adulterated products might find his customers going elsewhere. The threat of losing business was a more immediate sanction than any legal penalty, and it didn't require any official action to implement. Women began to organize this purchasing power collectively. If one customer complained, a vendor might ignore her. But if a dozen customers, all of whom knew each other and talked to each other, started shopping elsewhere, that was a different matter. Informal boycotts emerged in some neighborhoods, with women agreeing together to avoid vendors who had been caught cheating. These boycotts were rarely formalized or publicly announced. They operated through the same social networks that spread testing knowledge, conversations between neighbors, gossip at market, warnings passed from mother to daughter. A vendor's reputation could be destroyed without anyone ever confronting him directly. He would simply notice that his regular customers weren't coming around anymore. The effectiveness of these informal sanctions varied depending on local circumstances. In neighborhoods where residents knew each other and communicated regularly, collective action was relatively easy to organize. In more transient or fragmented communities, such coordination was harder, and vendors could more easily escape accountability by drawing from a larger, more anonymous customer base. Market conditions also mattered. Where competition was fierce and consumers had many choices, the threat of losing business was potent. Where a neighborhood with only one baker, for instance, couldn't easily punish that baker through boycott without cutting off its own bread supply. Still, the shift in consumer consciousness was real and significant. People who had passively accepted whatever the market provided now approached their shopping with skepticism and caution. They asked questions they hadn't asked before. They demanded explanations they wouldn't have expected before. They were, in short, becoming active rather than passive participants in the marketplace. This activation extended beyond individual shopping decisions to collective organizing. The Victorian era saw the emergence of various societies and associations dedicated to consumer protection, and women played important roles in many of these organizations. Though formal leadership was often male, as was typical of the period, the actual work of organizing, communicating, and mobilizing was frequently done by women whose domestic roles gave them both the motivation and the networks to be effective. Some of these organizations focused specifically on food quality. They collected complaints, publicized findings, and lobbied for reform. They organized public meetings where experts could explain the problem and ordinary people could share their experiences. They created platforms for voices that might otherwise have gone unheard. Other organizations had broader mandates but included food purity as part of their agenda. Working-class mutual aid societies, temperance organizations, and various reform movements all found reasons to concern themselves with food adulteration. The issue touched on so many other concerns: public health, economic justice, moral behavior, the proper role of government, that it attracted attention from groups with diverse primary interests. The mechanics of Victorian organizing are interesting to consider, because they operated without the communication technologies we take for granted. There was no internet to spread information instantly, no social media to organize protests in real time. Organizing required physical meetings, printed materials, and personal networks built through face-to-face contact. This made the work slow and labor-intensive, but it also created durable connections that electronic communication sometimes lacks. When you organized a meeting by personally visiting dozens of households, you knew those people. When they came together in a church hall or community room, they formed relationships that extended beyond the immediate issue. The networks built through this kind of organizing persisted and could be activated again for future causes. The printed materials of the movement, pamphlets, handbills, circulars, are fascinating artifacts of popular communication. These were not the polished publications of professional writers, but the urgent, sometimes rough-hewn productions of people with a message to share and limited resources with which to share it. They combined scientific information with moral exhortation, practical advice with political argument. A typical pamphlet might explain how to conduct home tests for common adulterations, describe the health consequences of consuming adulterated food, name specific vendors who had been caught cheating, and call on readers to support legislative reform. It would be printed cheaply on low-quality paper, distributed hand-to-hand at meetings and markets, and read aloud in households where not everyone could read for themselves. The tone of these pamphlets varied widely. Some adopted the measured voice of scientific authority, presenting findings in language borrowed from the investigators whose work they were popularizing. Still others emphasized practical self-help, teaching readers how to protect themselves without waiting for government action. The distribution of these materials was itself a form of activism. Simply handing someone a pamphlet was an act of engagement, an invitation to conversation, an opportunity to recruit another person to the cause. They were the connective tissue of the movement, linking isolated individuals into a collective force. Let's pause here and imagine a specific scene, because abstractions about organizing and activism can obscure the lived reality of what these efforts looked like. It's A group of perhaps 20 women has gathered in the back room of a chapel, seated on hard wooden benches arranged in rows. The room is plain, whitewashed walls, a small fireplace that doesn't quite keep out the November chill, a table at the front where the speakers will stand. The meeting has been organised by a local woman, let's call her Mrs. Thompson, who works as a seamstress and has been concerned about food quality since her youngest child fell ill after eating sweets bought from a street vendor. She's not Mrs. Thompson has invited a speaker from a reform organisation in London, a young man with connections to the scientific investigators who's been travelling around the country giving talks about food adulteration. He's brought with him a small collection of samples and the equipment to conduct simple tests, which he will demonstrate for the audience. The meeting begins with a prayer. This is Victorian England, after all, and most gatherings of this sort include some religious element. Then Mrs. Thompson introduces the speaker, explaining why she organised the meeting and what she hopes the audience will learn. The speaker launches into his presentation, describing the findings of recent investigations in language that his working-class audience can understand. He explains what alum is, how it gets into bread, and what effects it has on digestion. He describes the colorants used in sweets and the dangers they pose to children. He talks about watered milk and the diseases it can carry. As he speaks, women in the audience nod, recognizing their own experiences in his descriptions. The milk that seemed thin, the bread that didn't satisfy, the children who got sick so often. What had seemed like isolated incidents are now revealed as symptoms of a systematic problem. Then comes the demonstration. The speaker sets out his equipment on the table and conducts a few simple tests, talking the audience through each step. He tests a sample of bread that Mrs. Thompson purchased that morning from a local baker, and the telltale blue colour reveals the presence of alum. He tests a sample of coffee, and chicory is clearly visible when it's spread on water. The audience gasps and murmurs. This is local food from shops they all know, being revealed as adulterated right before their eyes. After the demonstration, there's time for questions and discussion. Women share their own observations and suspicions. They ask practical questions about how to conduct tests themselves, where to get the necessary materials, how to interpret the results. They ask political questions about what can be done to change things, who should be held responsible, what role the government should play. By the end of the meeting, Mrs. Thompson has recruited several women to help with ongoing organising. They'll host similar meetings in their own neighbourhoods, distribute pamphlets to their friends and family, and coordinate their purchasing to reward honest vendors and punish cheaters. A network is forming, one node at a time, connecting isolated individuals into a collective movement. This scene, or something like it, was repeated hundreds of times across England during the 1850s and 60s. Each meeting was small, its immediate impact limited, but taken together, they represented something significant. The emergence of a popular constituency for food reform, a mass of ordinary people who understood the problem and were ready to support solutions. The involvement of women in this movement was particularly significant given the limited public role that Victorian society assigned to them. Women couldn't vote, couldn't hold most public offices, and were generally expected to confine their activities to the domestic sphere. But food was precisely a domestic issue. It was women's work to purchase and prepare food, and therefore women's concern when that food was compromised. This gave women a kind of authority on food issues that they lacked in other political domains. When a woman spoke about the quality of bread or milk, she spoke from experience that men couldn't easily dismiss. Her knowledge was practical, embodied, rooted in the daily work of feeding a family. The scientific investigators might have the credentials, but the housewives had the experience. Some women leveraged this authority to take on more visible public roles. They gave testimony to parliamentary committees investigating the food supply. They organised petitions demanding legislative action. In each case, their domestic expertise gave their voices a weight that they wouldn't have had on other issues. The cooking and domestic advice literature of the period increasingly addressed food adulteration, reflecting and reinforcing the concern that ordinary women were expressing. Books and magazines that taught women how to manage their households began including sections on how to detect and avoid adulterated products. This integration of food safety into the standard curriculum of domestic education ensured that the message would reach women who might never attend an organising meeting or read a political pamphlet. The recipes themselves sometimes incorporated quality checks. A cookbook might instruct the reader to test her flour before using it in a recipe, or to examine her spices carefully for signs of adulteration. These embedded tests normalised the practice of skeptical consumption, making it part of routine household management rather than an exceptional response to unusual circumstances. The connection between food purity and maternal duty was particularly powerful in Victorian culture. A good mother was supposed to protect her children from harm, and what could be more fundamental than protecting them from poisoned food? The rhetoric of maternal responsibility was deployed effectively by reformers, framing the fight against adulteration as a defense of the home and family against commercial exploitation. This framing had advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, it gave women a legitimate public voice on an issue that directly affected their families. On the other hand, it reinforced traditional gender roles, defining women's political participation through their domestic duties rather than as citizens in their own right. The tension between these aspects of the movement would persist and would shape the broader women's rights movements that emerged later in the century. Men, of course, were also involved in the popular movement against food adulteration, though their involvement often took different forms. Working-class men who organised through trade unions and friendly societies brought food purity into those contexts, connecting it to broader concerns about the exploitation of workers by capital. Middle-class men who participated in reform organisations provided financial support, political connections and public credibility that helped amplify the movement's message. The integration of food reform into the labour movement was particularly important. Trade unions represented organised power that could be brought to bear on political questions, and their endorsement of food legislation gave it a constituency that politicians had to take seriously. When workers' organisations declared that food purity was a matter of worker welfare, they were claiming an issue that might otherwise have seemed disconnected from their primary concerns. The friendly societies, mutual aid organisations that provided insurance and support to their members, also engaged with food issues. These societies had a direct interest in member health, since they paid out benefits when members were sick or died. Anything that reduced illness among their members reduced their costs, which made food safety a matter of organisational self-interest as well as general welfare. Some friendly societies went beyond advocacy to direct action. They established their own cooperative stores that sold unadulterated provisions to members at fair prices. These cooperatives represented an alternative to the compromised commercial marketplace, demonstrating that it was possible to supply pure food profitably and creating competitive pressure on conventional retailers. The cooperative movement, which had begun in the 1840s with the Rochdale pioneers, included food purity as one of its founding principles. Cooperative stores committed to selling only honest goods at honest prices, explicitly contrasting themselves with the adulterated products available elsewhere. They conducted their own testing of products and rejected suppliers who failed to meet their standards. These cooperatives were more than just shops. They were experiments in alternative economics, demonstrating that commerce didn't have to be based on deception. By proof, if the cooperatives could sell pure food and still make money, why couldn't other retailers do the same? The success of the cooperative movement attracted attention and imitation. Conventional retailers, facing competition from cooperatives that advertised their purity, had incentives to improve their own practices. Some began advertising their products as pure or unadulterated, trying to capture the market segment that cared about quality. Of course, such claims weren't always accurate. There was nothing to prevent an advertiser from lying, but they at least indicated that purity had become a selling point rather than an irrelevance. The press played a crucial role in amplifying popular concerns and keeping food adulteration in the public eye. We've already discussed the Lancet's role in publishing scientific findings, but the general newspapers were equally important in reaching a broader audience. Editors discovered that food stories sold papers, and they were happy to run articles that combined public interest with moral outrage. The typical newspaper story about adulteration combined several elements: scientific information about what adulterants had been found and what dangers they posed, human interest angles focusing on victims or heroic investigators, moral commentary about the wickedness of poisoning the public for profit, and often calls for action either by consumers or by government. These stories framed adulteration as a drama with clear villains and victims, making it compelling reading even for those who might not have been interested in dry scientific reports. Editors also encouraged reader participation, printing letters from housewives describing their experiences and inviting others to share their own stories. This created a feedback loop where public concern drove coverage, and coverage in turn heightened public concern. Some newspapers went further, conducting their own investigations rather than just reporting on others. Journalists purchased food samples, had them tested and published the results, sometimes naming the vendors involved. This investigative journalism extended the work of the scientific analysts into the mass media, reaching audiences who would never read The Lancet but might pick up a penny paper. The visual arts also contributed to public awareness. Illustrations in newspapers and magazines depicted the horrors of food adulteration in vivid, sometimes lurid terms. Cartoons showed greedy vendors adulterating their products while innocent children suffered. Diagrams explained chemical tests that readers could conduct themselves. These visual elements made the abstract problem concrete and memorable. The satirical press had a field day with food adulteration, mocking the vendors, the regulators, and everyone else involved. Punch magazine ran numerous cartoons skewering the food trade, depicting bakers as criminals and vendors as poisoners. This satirical treatment helped maintain public attention even when the immediate sense of crisis faded, keeping the issue alive between major scandals. The theatre, comic plays and music hall sketches made jokes about adulterated food, assuming that audiences would understand the references and find them funny. This entertainment function was actually important for the movement, because it kept food purity in the cultural conversation even when people weren't actively thinking about reform. Let's return now to the organisational level and examine how the various strands of popular activism came together into something approaching a coordinated movement. The formation of dedicated pure food organisations represented an important step in this process. These organisations brought together individuals and groups who had been working separately, creating platforms for coordination and collective action. They provided institutional continuity that individual activists couldn't maintain on their own, ensuring that the movement would persist even when particular leaders moved on. Some of these organisations focused narrowly on food issues, conducting testing, publicising results, and lobbying for legislation. Others had broader mandates, public health organisations, sanitary reform societies, and similar groups that included food purity as part of a larger agenda. The boundaries between these different types of organisations were often porous, with individuals participating in multiple groups and ideas flowing freely between them. The leadership of these organisations was typically middle class and often professionally connected to medicine or science. Doctors and chemists lent credibility and expertise, while lawyers and businessmen provided organisational skills and resources. But the membership extended well beyond these professional circles to include working-class activists, housewives, and ordinary citizens who simply cared about the issue. Funding was always a challenge for these organisations. Unlike the food trade, which had obvious commercial interests to protect and the resources to protect them, the pure food movement relied on donations, membership dues, and volunteer labour. The asymmetry of resources meant that the movement had to be clever about how it deployed its limited means, focusing on activities that would have disproportionate impact. Public meetings were one such high-leverage activity. A well-organised meeting could attract press coverage, generate new recruits, and create political pressure, all for relatively modest cost. The meetings provided opportunities for experts to educate the public, for activists to share experiences, and for organisers to build the networks that would sustain ongoing work. Petitions represented another low-cost, high-impact tactic. Collecting signatures required labour but little money, and a petition with thousands of names demonstrated public support in a way that politicians couldn't easily ignore. The petition drives themselves served organising functions, giving volunteers reasons to knock on doors and have conversations that might recruit new supporters. The lobbying of Parliament required different skills and resources. Here the movement needed access to members who would champion the cause, expertise in drafting legislation, and persistence in navigating the complex legislative process. The professional classes who led many pure food organisations were well positioned for this work, bringing connections and credibility that working-class activists might have lacked. The relationship between popular activism and elite advocacy was complex and sometimes tense. The grassroots activists sometimes resented the professionals who claimed credit for work that ordinary people had done. But despite these tensions, the different elements of the movement generally recognized that they needed each other. The experts needed the masses to demonstrate public support for reform. The masses needed the experts to provide credibility and access to power. The symbiosis was imperfect but functional, and together the different elements of the movement achieved more than any could have achieved alone. The opposition they faced was formidable. The food trade had money, organisation, and political connections that the reformers couldn't match. Trade associations lobbied against regulation, warning of economic disruption and job losses. Sympathetic politicians raised objections and introduced amendments designed to weaken proposed legislation. The ideology of laissez-faire provided intellectual cover for those who wanted to leave markets unregulated. Some of the opposition arguments had elements of validity. Regulation did impose costs on businesses, some of which were passed on to consumers. Enforcement was indeed imperfect, and some honest operators were caught up in prosecutions meant for the dishonest. The line between acceptable and unacceptable practices wasn't always clear, and reasonable people could disagree about where it should be drawn. But they had the public increasingly informed and increasingly outraged by what they had learned. They had persistence, refusing to give up even when progress seemed impossibly slow. The Bradford poisoning of 1858 was a turning point, not because it introduced new information, but because it crystallized public opinion in a way that previous revelations